foggy evening. I call to order the January 8th, 2015 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission. Ask everyone to silence all electronic devices before the meeting begins. So if it goes ring, ring, ding, ding, whatever, throw it out the window, put it on silent running. Heather, would you call the roll?
Phyllis McKee.
Here.
Ollie Taishi.
Here.
Garen O'Brien.
Here.
Tom Gunstad.
Here.
Steve Crooks.
Here.
Cerise Noah.
Here.
And Jeff Brown's absent.
Thank you. According to the agenda, the first item is selection of the 2015 Planning Commission Chair and Vice Chair. So, is there anybody who wants to be sheriff of this vigilante posse?
Can I make a nomination?
Absolutely.
I'd like to nominate Ali Tashi.
I second it.
Ali has been nominated and seconded. Is there anybody else? No. Well, then, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great.
Should we? You getting up right now? All right. Should we? Or I'd like to make a motion to nominate a vice chair, and I'd like to nominate Tom. If he
Second. If he doesn't refuse.
Yeah, unless he refuses.
I would also nominate Garrett for vice.
Second.
Wow.
So we have to vote, huh?
So do we have to have a discussion, or should we just call a vote?
Well, maybe we should
Do we
see
want
if
to ask
Tom wants to do
Tom
it.
or Garrett? Yeah, I just thought I'd nominate you, Tom, because you know the ropes. So if I'm gone, and I know I'm going to be gone at least once or twice this year, someone who knows what they're doing. But if you're not interested,
I would be perfectly willing to let Garrett learn the ropes.
Great.
okay. Well, then we should probably vote. So let's call the vote for Garrett Bryan for vice chair. We can just do a voice vote.
Yeah.
Okay. All in favor? Say
Aye.
All opposed? So Garrett, you are the vice chair.
Okay, then.
I'm gone in March. I'll let you know the date.
You're gone next week.
Okay. Well,
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, if I may say something before we continue, I would certainly like to thank Tom as being our chair for the last 2 years. His professionalism and expertise has been a great addition to this commission, and I recognize it. I'm sure everybody else does, and a sincere thank you, Tom, for the time you've spent handling the gavel.
Well, thank you.
I agree.
I would echo that.
second. Okay, so I guess I'll continue on, and I'm new to this, so everyone in the audience, bear with me as we'll kind of slowly work through the first steps here. I think the first item is approving the minutes from the past 2 meetings in December, and we'll start with the December 4th minutes, and assume everyone's looked at those.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. So let's have a vote on that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, so those minutes are approved. And then we also had a meeting on the 18th for the holiday, and we're going to be voting on those minutes as well. So we have a motion? Any
Motion
discussion?
to approve the minutes?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion about those minutes? All right, let's have a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, and those minutes are approved. So, next on the agenda is the public comment period. This is an opportunity for the public to address the commission on a topic that is not the subject of our public hearing tonight, which is the affordable housing program ordinance. So if you want to talk about anything else tonight, please come on up. There's no sign-up sheet. Just come down and one at a time, and we'd like to hear what you have to say. And please state your name and address for the record.
Hi, my name is David Cunningham. You guys have seen me in the last few meetings. One of the commissioners last meeting asked a question and the staff answered, and I was a little surprised by this because it was a piece of information I didn't know, and that was when a developer does a subdivision and they put covenants on their property, that the city doesn't have a say in what those covenants are. And I was curious about that, if I really understood that correctly. And the other thing that I was wondering that came out of that for me was if the developer is able to put restrictions on their property that the city has no say on, and that undermines the zoning of that area or what the city needs to do, is there a way to deal with that? The second part of that question is, if that's so, why couldn't an individual property owner put covenants on their property and undermine the zoning or whatever it is the city was trying to do? So I just wanted to bring that up because I've been mulling that over Christmas here, and it bothers me. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And if I could speak to that, I don't think any of us probably know the answer to that question, but it's a fair question. I remember the comment that was made, and so I don't know if you guys have ever dealt with that, Kurt, and could answer that question easily now. If not, we could come back to it another time.
Sure. Well, what we can do, Kurt Nabafeld, Planning and Community Development Department. What we can do is I can provide kind of a brief overview tonight, and then we'll make sure that in our next public process associated with the subdivision ordinance that we can make it very clear at that time for others as well. So generally what the state law allows is it does allow for people to come forward with private covenants. Again, this is land that is private land, so they have the ability to put restrictions on their land. What the city does do is we do review those covenants to ensure that they're not conflicting with any state codes. There could be some conflictions with some of our policies and goals, but the codes is what we really look at. So if there's any specific confliction with the code, then we comment on it. I think that's the general overview that I could give, the brief overview at this point, and then I'll make sure that we come back with a more detailed response in our subsequent meetings if that's adequate. Or I can also talk with Mr. Cunningham after the fact, and we can have him come down to the office, or we can do it by email or telephone conversation as well.
Thank you.
And it's true that a developer or a property owner could not place a restrictive covenants that was against state or federal law. Is that correct?
That's correct as well.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Thank you. My name is Ann Mackey, and I'm in the York neighborhood, and I live at 1351 Humboldt Street. And for many years now, I've been an active participant in the planning process in our neighborhood, having been the planning chair for our association, planning chair for our committee that reviewed our neighborhood plan amendments and did a rezone and a second rezone, and we're really, really intensely involved in our neighborhood, as many of the other neighborhoods are involved in their planning and will be involved in the upcoming comprehensive plan update. And what I wanted to comment on tonight is in kind of a reflection to having watched the December 18th public hearing on the subdivision regulation changes. And I was struck by the conversations among the commissioners about having brown bag lunches and talking with more of the development community and the builders and the Building Industry Association. And I thought it would be useful for the commissioners to know that I think neighborhood activists and people that have been intensely involved with their own planning in their neighborhoods would be open to being invited to any of your brown bag lunches and to be included in the process for all of these significant changes that are being proposed in the coming year. And I think it's just useful to not forget the important stakeholders, which are the neighborhoods, and our Growth Management Act calls out very specifically the importance of maintaining the integrity of neighborhoods and involvement in the public process with neighborhoods. So those are my comments, and thank you for the opportunity to share them.
Thank you, Ann. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak?
Wendy Harris. And I'd sort of like to build on what Ms. Mackey was talking about. I'm here tonight to ask the council to consider continuing the public hearing that's scheduled for next week on the critical area ordinance update. That is part of the comp plan process. It's part of the GMA. And one of the GMA goals is public participation. And I did not find out about this document being ready to move forward until 2 weeks ago. And I have spent the last week trying to work with the city on procedural problems and errors. I haven't even had a chance to begin looking at the actual substance of this 70-page document that involves 5 different kinds of critical areas and mitigation provisions. And the thing that upset me the most was that there was no public information session, no notice to the public. This is not even mentioned in the public participation plan for the comp plan update. When I was reading through the documents, I saw that the city had called a stakeholder group and 2 advisory groups. That was never told to the public. That stakeholder group was comprised solely of developers. And these are environmental regulations, and it didn't occur to the city to contact environmentalists or the neighborhood. That's a little concerning to me, and I can tell you for a fact many of us would like to weigh in, but we don't have the time. And what the city wants to do is have the hearing next week and then hold the hearing session open. But that's not the same thing as giving us time to be prepared, to come and testify, and to let the public know this is going on. Because there is nothing that is as important to our environmental regulations, our public health and safety, than the CAO, with the exception of the SMP. They go hand in hand. These are crucial documents. The public participation is not only a goal of the GMA, there's a couple of references or state statutes that address it, and there's also provisions in the administrative code that go into more detail of what a good public participation plan would require. And clearly it envisions notice and communications and discussions before the document ever comes before the Planning Commission. So I have never once asked for this before, and I'm doing it because I think that the city did not open the process the way it should have. And I also think because this is such a complex topic, I don't understand how they expect to just have you guys have a public hearing on the 15th and then your next meeting have a work session and it's done with. I'm actually a member of the county's Citizen Advisory Committee for their CAO. That's a 2-year process, and you had to apply for that position, and it was an open application, and the same thing with their technical advisory group. And all our meetings are open. We have public process. The public can come speak. It's all listed on the county website. And And I would like to have the time to put materials together to show the Planning Commission what a good public participation plan for a critical area update could look like. So I was told that it was the chair that would have to rule on this decision. So again, my request is that you continue the hearing on the 15th and treat that as an information session where the staff can come and inform you and inform the public of some of the basics that we'll be reviewing and updating. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And what we'll do is when the public hearing is done tonight and we have discussion of the next scheduled meeting and old and new business, I'll provide an opportunity for the commission to discuss that, and then we'll make a decision at that point at the end. Thank you, though. Anyone else would like to speak in the public comment period? Okay, seeing nobody, I'm going to move on to the next item, which is our public hearing. And looks like we've got Kurt Nabefeld and David Stahlheim here from the city to present, so I think we'll start with staff presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. David Stahlheim, Planning and Community Development, and I drew the short straw on this ordinance. So I get to come to the Planning Commission. I've never been here before you guys in this role here, so it's a pleasure to be here. This ordinance was first done in 2004, and so this is ordinance that had been always sunsetted at first on a yearly basis and then every 2 years, and it actually has now expired as of December 31st of 2014, so the ordinance is no longer on the books. And so when we talked about renewing it the last time 2 years ago, the council asked, why aren't we talking about a permanent ordinance? And so we're bringing it to you as a permanent ordinance at this point in time, recognizing that there actually isn't even an ordinance in place. Drafting this amendment really was a collaborative effort within our department. Some of the other staff were busy with things, so I volunteered to help get this done. But Chris Cook has drafted several of these sections, and then Kurt Nabefeld has collaborated and helped in setting some of the direction on this amendment along with Greg Alcott. So what this ordinance is that it's an ordinance that establishes incentives to create basically low-income housing for home ownership. And the incentives that are in this ordinance include a 50% density increase over the underlying zoning, modifications to other zoning requirements including minimum lot size, street frontage, setbacks, parking, lot coverage, and usable open space. The housing would have to be affordable to those that are earning less than 80% of area median income. When I kind of get through some of the staff reporting, I'm going to show you what those incomes are so you kind of get a little context of what that would be. As I mentioned, the ordinance modifies an existing ordinance that now is expired. Some of the changes that we have in this versus the previous ordinances, we've made some amendments or proposed some amendments to remove the requirement that it be permanently affordable, instead having 50 years of affordability. This would in turn open it up to private developers. As permanent affordability, there's only one organization that would be eligible for the program, and that would be Culshan Community Land Trust. Other changes in here includes allowing the projects to have mixed income housing rather than 100% low income, is that it would have mixed affordability, and so we have recommended that 75% of the units be affordable low-income units rather than 100%. We've also recommended that we have encouraged some of the walkability incentives for projects for low-income, that they be within 1/4 mile of a transit route. And Chris has helped draft some design standards for the projects that are specific for single-family homes rather than multifamily design standards. Finally, the last major change that we have is the final decisions would move from, rather than at City Council, would go to the hearing examiner with appeals either to City Council or to Superior Court. And we've provided you with two different options of process for appeals in the staff report and in the ordinance. So as I mentioned, this ordinance has been routinely renewed since 2004, 5 different times. But in the 10 years that this ordinance has been in place, it's been used only 2 times. So there's been 2 projects, Mathai Place that Culshan put together down on the south side of town. And then another project up in the Birchwood neighborhood at Lafayette Street was done, a 3-unit project. It's actually under construction right now. Some of the issues that we've seen in the discussions and feedback that we've gotten is that the previous ordinance had limited applicability, that it only applied to one organization, and that was Culshan, and that was due to the permanent affordability requirements. Private developers were not able, or other organizations were not able to use this model. The requirements that all units be affordable also reduced the incentives to have mixed unit developments. And the process that required basically 2 steps of going to the hearing examiner and city council added additional time and potential delays in the process. And so finishing the process of the hearing examiner with either subject to appeals to city council or to Superior Court would help reduce the timeline for that. In your staff report, I've provided several comprehensive plan goals and policies that look to support this, including issues of affordability and design flexibility, density bonus. There's quite a few things within the comprehensive plan for that. And in our transportation vision, it also talks about patterns that encourage walking, biking, and transit use through incentives and zoning regulations to encourage people to live within walking distance of shopping and employment. The Growth Management Act was amended back in 2006 to actually address some affordable housing issues. The prime purpose is that in the past there was some efforts in certain areas to actually require affordable housing as a requirement of projects. And so the legislature said, amended the Growth Management Act that says you cannot require affordable housing. However, you can provide incentives to have affordable housing. And if you do incentives, it has to kind of follow this pattern that we outlined in the Growth Management Act. And those incentives could talk about things like density bonuses, like we're talking about here, height and bulk, fee waivers, parking reductions, expedited permitting, mixed use projects. Those are the things that were outlined in the Growth Management Act. They defined affordable housing in the Act for owner-occupied as those at 80% of area median income or less. And they said that the incentives had to be a commitment for of at least 50 years. And so if you're going to do affordable housing and have this as an incentive under that, is that it had to be available for at least 50 years. So as we looked at this, one of the things that we identified is that incentives that are never or rarely used are really not achieving their end result and should be adjusted. And so looking at an ordinance that only has had been used twice in the past 10 years indicates that it's probably not achieving its objectives perhaps there. As a result, what we've looked at is dealing with those things I highlighted earlier, and I'll go into a little bit more detail here to look at ways that we can actually produce really what we're looking at as more outcome, is to create more affordable units for low-income households. And the first is the length of affordability. This proposal really would, in essence, potentially open it up for private developers. Honestly, I'm not sure that we're going to ever attract private developers because most private developers will not be interested in resale restrictions for 50 years. I think it's going to be a pretty hard sell even at 50 years. But 50 years is less than permanent. So perhaps that's a little bit more of an incentive there. The second is project mix. Projects that require nothing but 100% affordability precluded any kind of projects that might want to have a mix of income. And mix of income is actually good socially as well, not only from a private development project, being able to put a development together, but it's also good to not have concentrated low income, concentrated poverty, to have mix of incomes within any kind of neighborhood is a good thing for our community. Project location and design. Transportation costs are typically the second largest expenditure for any household. And so low-income households, we're trying to reduce those costs. The transportation cost is one way to make the dollar stretch better, and having a requirement that it be 1/4 mile of transit or an urban village is consistent with kind of reducing those costs and the cost burdens for low-income households. The demonstration ordinance I mentioned earlier had the design requirements were tied around multifamily design, and so they really didn't fit very well for single-family projects, which is this is all about. And so the new standards that are in here that are proposed are consistent with well-designed single-family home projects, put together massing elements, articulation, trim details, front porch, front doors, walkways, location of garage, fencing, and landscaping standards. Finally, in the approval procedure mentioned earlier, is we provided two different alternatives within the staff report and the ordinances. One alternative is to have the decision of the hearing examiner subject to appeal before City Council, and that's your alternative A, which would be a type 3B land use approval process. Or alternative B is decision of the hearing examiner subject to appeal to Superior Court, and that would be a type 3A land use decision. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to show you a couple different things if I can figure out. Heather told me how to do this, and wow, it just works just like that, huh? Cool. So when we talk about affordability and 80% of area median income, does this make it bigger? Thank you, Heather. Make it focused. Okay. We're trying to get on the income limits there. Perfect. So what we're talking about is income limits of 80% AMI or below. And so the way incomes work, it's based on household size. And so let's assume for Bellingham, most of the household size for home ownership are between 2 and 3 people per household. So let's assume that we're looking at 3 people per household. So the 80% AMI limit is $48,080 in 2014. These are reviewed by HUD every year, and they're adjusted for that. And so one of the comments that we got from some folks in conversation is that when we use the term low income, people are thinking perhaps even lower incomes than this. And so really that number, 48,080, is really in some of our block grant world, it's mixed income or moderate income. It's moving towards that level of moderate income here. But what people are finding is that in large measure is that it's hard to find homes that they can afford at that level as well. And so trying to find ways to incentivize to create more homes and more inventory that people, 3-person households that are earning $48,000 can buy. We have to find either ways to incentivize that or perhaps subsidize it through our housing levy or other federal funding programs in there. But it certainly isn't kind of the caricature that you might think about low income and poverty and things like that. So it is a little bit more of a moderate income area. We had some testimony that came in from folks from both Birchwood and then from Wendy Harris as well that talked about 2 different things. One was to not have this ordinance apply in neighborhoods that had more than 40% of the area was considered low income or below 80% or below of area median income. And so we track the neighborhoods from HUD census data that we have, and so all these areas that are kind of in orange are the areas that more than 50% of the neighborhoods are considered by HUD as low income. But when we add the 40% areas in, we add quite a few other neighborhoods as well, resulting in the only areas that would, this ordinance, if that recommendation, that input was brought in that would be eligible would be these areas in green here and down south in this area. So that would only be, this ordinance would only be applicable in those areas if we use that as a criteria. The ordinance also has a recommendation that it not apply in the Lake Whatcom watershed, so all this area would be out. And Wendy provided comments that it would also not apply within the Patton Creek watershed and within the Chuckanut Creek watershed, so all this area would be out. So in essence, between those different recommendations, the only areas that would be left would be there, here, here, and here. I'll give you a little context of how that would work out on the ground. Today, and you probably haven't had a chance to look at the recommendations, but there was comments and concern about the quarter mile of transit, of having that as a criteria. And so I asked our GIS staff to quickly look at that as an option here. And so this is buffering quarter mile of transit. And so the only areas that it would not be eligible are these areas, which happen to also somewhat correspond to the areas where the other areas are pushing it to. And so, so if we did, so that's a challenge there. But you do see that it's actually, the city is pretty well served by transit, that it's pretty amazing how much is within a quarter mile of transit routes. It's not all necessarily a quarter mile walkable. And so some of them, this map will get a little bit smaller when you start looking at some walkability issues for walkable distance to that. But it certainly is quite a bit of coverage in that. One of the other things I wanted to quickly also address, and maybe it's because the person that runs the city's affordable housing financing program was drafting this ordinance, and so somehow there was a big tie of this ordinance to the housing levy and some expectations of the housing levy. And this ordinance isn't necessarily tied to the levy whatsoever. And so all levy projects have to come through a competitive process to the city. So applications come in, they have to compete for funding that's available, and those projects are reviewed for funding. So projects could come and get enabled through this process and then come and request funding, but there's no certainty that it would be there. And there's no direct nexus between this ordinance and the city's funding. The other thing that's important to kind of recognize is that the housing levy itself, less than 5% of the funding actually goes to home ownership. So the levy is actually really about really lower income targets. We allocate more than 50% of the funding to rental housing development for those people that are earning less than 50% of area median income. So we're targeting very, very low income populations, largely with the levy projects. The other thing is the issue of the tying in. If we actually did finance a project through the levy, and we set a 50-year affordability period, and the levy actually every project that we have in the levy is 50 years of affordability. We don't require permanent affordability in anything in the levy, and part of that reason is that there's no funder of buildings that will fund the mortgage on a construction that will fund anything more than 50 years. So a funder won't get involved and finance a project. And the way that Culshan does is that the land is separated from the building improvements. And so Culshan can do it because there's a separation of the land and the home. And so the home has a 99-year lease, and a private lender actually funds to the improvements on the building and not onto the land. And so the land is held that way. But if you're funding actually the construction of the buildings, then any lender is not going to fund anything that has any restrictions more than 50 years of time. But if we do fund things, even at a 50 years restriction, if the deal that we have is every dollar we put into real estate under the levy or any of our federal funds is done with security. And so we have a promissory note and a deed of trust in every transaction that we do. And so we either get paid back or there's continued affordability. So even at the end of the 50-year period, if that 50-year period is up, either that person pays us back and those funds go back into affordable housing, or the project continues with an affordability. So no matter what, even if we have 50 years and we fund the project will continue, or we get paid back, and there's continued benefit as a result of that. So you did have, since we wrote the staff report and you've gotten that, some comments, I believe, are forwarded to you from Wendy Harris and from the Birchwood Neighborhood Association. And then today there was a comment that I believe Heather gave you that just came in from Paul Schisler with comments. But with that, I'm just going to leave it at that and try to answer any questions that you might have at this point.
Thank you, David. So at this time, we'll take questions from the commissioners that are clarifying questions for David, or related to clarification of the staff report. We won't go into discussion, and then we'll have the public have their opportunity to speak. And then we're going to do something a little different that we talked about at the last meeting, I believe, or maybe a couple meetings ago, where we're going to give the audience a chance to clarify any of their comments after staff presents. And I'll get into more detail about what you should be talking about at that time, but that's how we're going to work through this. So at this time, if any commissioners have any clarifying questions, David, it looks like Steve.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. First of all, it's the quarter-mile restriction. If a quarter-mile is good, why not use a half a mile? Try to include, this seems like such a narrow alleyway to develop. I would think you would want to get a little bit bigger. I mean, another quarter of a mile, you're only talking about a 5-minute walk, and that's what you're trying to promote here. So I just question what was the reasoning behind the quarter mile.
So when we actually adopted some of the guidelines for our housing levy, we put a quarter mile in there, and it was based on a conversation that I had with Wacom Transit. And so Wacom Transit said that the number of people that are willing to ride the bus drops off dramatically based on research that they have after a quarter mile. So a 5-minute walk, anything beyond that is that usage drops dramatically. And so they recommend the quarter mile as being a standard for whatever we do for incentives for housing projects, and particularly for low income, is that they have found research-wise that that's a good standard. I recognize that, like I live almost really close on that quarter mile thing, and I see people beyond that limit that walk, that will get to a bus off of my street as well. And so it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but that is kind of a national standard that we use for consultation with them was a quarter mile.
Okay. Another quick question. On your income table, how do you define a person within a household? What, it has to be relative?
No, it's people living in the household. Now, this is home ownership, so it's people that are living in the household. But yeah, they don't have to be related, but they are in the household. They constitute that household. So yeah, they can be unrelated.
So you could actually move people out for a month, put them in an apartment, have a lower amount of people, have a lower threshold to hit for a lower type of income. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, potentially, yeah. I mean, this is a home ownership program, and you would think that, people are coming in, they're qualifying, they're going and they have to get a mortgage. Banks are looking at this stuff. They're seeing how many people are going to be in there. So it's pretty well scrutinized in terms of what would be looked at in terms of that household that normally is living there. So, yeah, I think, with anything, I'm sure there's ways to play the game, but I think it's pretty difficult with home ownership and with banks being involved in the financing of this as well.
Okay. One more quick question to the chairman. How are we going to decide on alternative A or B? When would that come up on the appeal process?
I think we should discuss that after the public hearing, or public comment part of the hearing, and during our discussion, and then at that point someone can make a motion on that topic.
Yes, I have a question about the waiving fees and so on, is that cost passed on then to somebody else? I mean, in other words, or is it just fees that are just not collected? I mean, it seems to me that if fees are appropriate to begin with, and they're not collected from these people to make the system function, that has to be made up someplace else. And I would just be curious to know, follow the dollars.
Yeah, so right now, the way that, so let me say, actually, so let's start with state law. So state law was amended, I think, about a year ago that allows local governments to waive 80% of impact fees for affordable housing, for low-income affordable housing, to waive 80%. So it goes away. So it's not passed on directly to anyone. No one else pays that. But of course, those impacts and the cost for the overall system is borne by the community. But no one has to make up and write a check for that amount of money. You can waive 100%, but then you would have to come up and someone would have to write a check for 20% of the funds. There's also a thing in the law that says you can't waive school impact fees without the agreement of the school district. So you can't do that. So any deals with school districts would require their consent. But to do that, the city would have to actually pass an ordinance to amend that. Right now, the city has the same thing that allows for waivers of impact fees, but we have to find another fund to pay for that. And so it's possible to do that. There have been waivers in the past that have been approved, but that has been made up with either general fund contributions or funding out of affordable housing programs. I believe Bellingham Housing Authority for one of their Walton projects got a fee waiver in the past for things. But otherwise, for other projects right now, there's other sources of funds. The county has set aside $1.2 million of their economic development funds for impact fees. And so there's a program that allows for that fund to be tapped for that purpose. Or they can come through our program for housing levy and federal funds and pay for that fee. So.
Okay, a follow-up question on that. When you're talking about a 50% change in density, that means that you could put two houses where one would normally be required or could be built if that weren't under this program. Is that how I should read that?
Well, if two houses are now allowed, you'd be able to build three houses. So you would be able to add one more. So it's 50% above the underlying. So it's half of, so if, or use 10 units. So if right now 10 units are allowed, you'd be able to build 15 with a 50% density bonus.
Thank you.
I just have a comment. I like consistency. It's a foible. And when you wrote this, you've got alternative A as a type 3B decision and alternative B as a type 3A decision. Why couldn't you make the A's go with the A's and the B's go with the B's?
It actually was it was a last minute during the Christmas thing, internal staff review issues and saying we really want to look at concern from city attorney of city council on quasi-judicial matters, of getting involved in quasi-judicial matters. And so city attorney feels fairly strongly that quasi-judicial matters are best handled by a hearing examiner in court. So yeah, it was just like last minute trying to get this out during the holidays type of thing. So I'll keep that in mind if I ever come back here again.
Streets? Phyllis?
Do you see any downside in either of these alternative A or B choices? I'm just, how would one play out with city council as opposed to the Superior Court? I mean, as far as time, complexity?
Well, if the project is going along and everyone's happy and there's no appeals, then everything ends at the hearing examiner, and so there would be no change. If it's a very contentious project, then you would have an appeal to city council, and then you would have potential appeal to Superior Court. So you'd have two different processes there. Again, kind of our city attorney is concerned that quasi-judicial matters is that are better handled by the hearing examiner in terms of keeping the record clear and straight rather than the council. And then even the current process, the council is a closed record hearing, and so it's supposed to be based only on the records in front of the hearing examiner. And it's pretty hard for elected officials to limit themselves to things that are supposed to happen in a previous venue. They like to talk to people and listen to them and tell them not to cut them off.
But neither would involve public input to the appeal process, or would there be?
No, because those are closed record appeals, so yeah, there wouldn't be any public input. The public input, the hearing would happen in front of the hearing examiner, which is the current process right now. So all the record is all built in front of the hearing examiner, and that's the process that currently exists. That's where all the public input is supposed to be. And Kurt, correct me if I'm wrong on that. So.
No, you're correct. Exactly. The hearing examiner currently holds an open public record hearing, and then what happens is the hearing examiner then makes a decision or a recommendation to the council, and that is a closed record hearing. So, as David mentioned, one of the proposals would have that same process. Instead of the decision, a closed record decision by city council, it would be an appeal, closed record appeal decision that would be heard. So.
Would an appeal to the Superior Court involve a legal representation for the applicant?
It typically does. I'm not positive that it's required, but it's best. Yeah, there's a lot of procedure things. It probably does require it, would be my guess, but I don't have the definitive answer on that. But my guess is that the end result is likely it would require that.
Do we have people signed up for comment? I have some questions, but
You want to wait?
I'd like to hear some comment before I got into my questions.
We can definitely have a longer discussion after public comment, so if everyone feels comfortable.
I just had one more question.
Sure.
Besides the obvious things that are being stated in here, is that what the changes would be, is there any 2 or 3 steps down, sort of a ripple effect kind of change that we should be aware of? Is that, I don't know if that's making sense to you. In other words, if you choose these, they're all on at face value, but sometimes you make a change in one thing and it has a ripple effect down the line on some impact. That unexpected consequences or anything like that that you might be aware of?
I mean, this ordinance is really quite similar to the previous ordinance, and so I don't see that. You know, we haven't got any input yet on the design standards for single-family homes. You know, I think they're solid from my perspective. You know, the effect may be, you know, we'll see how those design standards work when we get projects come in. I did have one phone call today about a little bit of concern about, in the past, if the ordinance didn't work well, at least the council could sunset it and it would go away. My response was, well, if ordinances don't work that are permanent, they can also go away by repealing the ordinance in total as well. So it's the same process. You just go and write an ordinance to repeal this if it, for some reason, doesn't work. So I can't see anything. I don't know if anything else.
No, if anything, I think that this has the opportunity to allow for more projects to occur. As David's mentioned, we've only seen 2 projects since this thing has begun in 10 years. And I think, you know, hopefully through our analysis of this, we're trying to add more opportunities to provide affordable home ownership, and we're hoping that that's going to be the outcome of this. That's what we're really hoping for, and hopefully those will be seen in the future.
Okay, thank you, David. So at this time, we're going to open the public comment. We've 3 people who've signed up. If you didn't sign up, it doesn't mean you can't speak. So we'll have these 3 people speak first. Then if anyone else would like to comment, please feel free to come down after those 3 folks have made their comment. Yes, sir?
Is that public comment time that we can ask questions about the ordinance that they mentioned, or
To staff?
about the
Yes, the intent of the public comment at this stage is to discuss the ordinance that was just described by staff. And if you have questions for staff during your comments, oftentimes staff will respond to those after the public comment period is ended. So we'll start with David Cunningham, and please try to limit your comments to 3 or 4 minutes. And David, come on down.
Thanks, David Cunningham again. Yes, I can limit it to 3 or 4 minutes. 2 things about this ordinance that kind of struck me when the presentation was going on. One of them is how small an area it is actually going to apply to in the city. And one of my big concerns is that in many ways that kind of helps our older neighborhoods like the Birchwood neighborhood, York neighborhood, et cetera, lettered streets, because very little of our neighborhood is going to be affected by this because of the relatively low income many of the neighborhoods have. One of the things that I get a little concerned about is the effort to create affordable housing in the city can potentially, if we can't do it this way, then we look for other ways to do it which would have a higher impact on the older neighborhoods. And I'm thinking of the ADUs, for instance, is a perfect example. And I think that it would be nice to find a way, and I think the suggestion someone made on the commission a little earlier about expanding out how far people could walk before, because that cuts out some areas that might be viable for low income. The other thing about that walking distance is it's a little bit like some of the statements that people have made in the past about if you build it, they will come. And I think that if we create the low income housing someplace that is close to the quarter mile, maybe it's a third of a mile or something instead, that we will actually get people willing to walk that distance and create more affordable housing in that process. So I'd really like to see, looking at some of the alternatives of how to expand that area out to cover a little bit more of the neighborhoods that it does apply to that look like they're being cut out because of the transit issue. The second issue, and I didn't hear anybody saying, this has to do, I think, with the affordable housing standards. And that is, what are we doing in terms of encouraging that affordable housing to be smaller units? Because I remember a couple of meetings ago, one of the people from the real estate or development community came in talking about how they have people that are looking for smaller houses. And I think in particular, when you have people that have a lower income, many of them will go with a smaller house because that's what they can afford. And it seems to me, I don't know what the development standards are for the housing, housing standards, whatever they're called. I'm not sure what they are exactly, but it seems to me that something could be written into that would encourage smaller units that would inherently make them more affordable and potentially find more places for them too. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list is Louise Bjornson.
Thank you. And I again like to thank all the members of the Planning Commission and also the staff. I know the staff works hours and hours behind the scenes making all this happen. I'm Louise Bjornson from the Birchwood neighborhood. And regarding the affordable housing ordinance, I was on the city council and voted for the original version for more affordable housing in Bellingham. So we put a lot of oversight in, just in case it did not work out as intended. You were talking about the unintended consequences. And I think that they put the new design standards in. I think that's very helpful. And also encouraging the housing to be on arterials or where WTA runs their buses. That's helpful for them so that they don't have to have a car. One thing I was thinking about, though, with regard to unintended consequences, at this time with so many other proposed changes, like the comp plan is being updated, the subdivision ordinance has proposed changes, they're talking about detached ADUs and toolkit and other infill proposals. So I'm concerned about the possible unforeseen consequences of taking out that oversight in the affordable housing ordinance. I think it's important to look at the big picture and see how all these go together. and how the results will impact the older single-family neighborhoods. Remember, these are the neighborhoods that do not have covenants to protect them. We in Bellingham have always prided ourselves on having great neighborhoods. And I mentioned before that in 1995 in Olympia, they had the SSB 5567 and addressed this concern after the Growth Management Act was passed. They went back and made a special edition providing for the preservation of single-family residential neighborhoods. They included that cities must recognize the vitality and character of the established residential neighborhoods. But they were concerned that this was not strong enough to adequately protect the single-family residential neighborhoods, so they said cities must include the provision to ensure the vitality and character of established residential neighborhoods. So I'm especially concerned about the Alderwood, Birchwood, and Cordata neighborhoods. They don't have their fair share of parks and open space. The elementary schools have a very high proportion of free and reduced lunches. Alderwood is 82%, Birchwood is 67%, and Cordata is 64%. We have diversity, but not economic diversity. Birchwood already has over 5,200 people, lots of apartments and commercial, but not its share of neighborhood parks and open space. So please leave the oversight in at this time. Still make it appealable to City Council so they know how things are working, because they're the ones that make the laws and will have to decide how this is happening. And continue as permanent low-income housing so that it's there tomorrow when we need it. And leave in the some kind of sunset clause. Look at the cumulative effects of single-family neighborhoods with the comp plan updates, the subdivision ordinance changes, the ADUs and toolkit proposals for infill. All this put together might have unintended consequences. I don't know what they might be, but I think we need to look at the big picture so that we continue to take care of our neighborhoods. These older single-family neighborhoods are valuable. Let's take care of them. There was a comment last time about renters and neighborhood associations. I just want to let you know that renters, homeowners, anyone that lives in the neighborhood is welcome to come to our meetings. Everyone's welcome. And I have a couple of handouts for you.
Thank you, Louise. Next on the list is Ann Mackey.
Also, I want to mention that we have a lot of Victory Garden neighborhoods, and I have a handout here about Victory Gardens and how many pounds, over 50,000 pounds of free vegetables came to our food bank because of Victory Gardens in our neighborhoods. Thank you.
Ann Mackey, and I live in the York neighborhood. And I have some comments and questions. The issue of affordable housing in the city of Bellingham is obviously a tremendous challenge, as Dave Stilheim's economic and income map demonstrated. And I'd really like to get copies of that in addition to the WTA transportation map that you shared. Our neighborhood is more than 50% rental. And I would say that the rents in our neighborhood run from $1,500 to $2,000 a month. Those are for 3-bedroom or sometimes 4-bedroom. These are really inflated rental rates in the York neighborhood, and I think it's probably true anywhere in the city where you have a university population like our neighborhood does. And I think that if we look at that, how the rental rates have become so inflated over the last 5 years, it helps us understand the story about why we have a lack of affordable housing. That affordable housing is locked up by the rental owners in the community, locked up in the sense that many of these homes were bought years ago. When they do come on the market, someone knows about it who's in the real estate industry. They know about it before it really comes on the open market. Young families can't race in and bid it up. And that's what we see happening, is that houses are being bid up in our neighborhood by individuals who have a nice big pot of money, because that's the industry that they're in, and so they can pay cash. And who selling a house doesn't want to sell to somebody who can just pay cash, you know. So our affordable, what potentially could be, you know, affordable housing, older homes, the historic housing stock in our older neighborhoods where a young family could buy them and fix them up, put in the sweat equity, which a lot of us did when we were, you know, when we had young children. That's kind of been taken out of the mix in this community. And so we're struggling with trying to find homes for families. They're being shoved out of our neighborhood because it's not affordable for them to rent anymore, and they're being shoved out into apartment complexes, which is a very destabilizing process for these families. So I'm very supportive of affordable home ownership, and that's the key. It's the families owning the homes. I'm not supportive of more housing units being developed by the owner who is not going to be living on that property. We already have that problem in our neighborhood, where tons of throughout the city, tons of illegal accessory units that are just not on the books. And the way the rule is right now in the city of Bellingham is that the owner must live in one of those units. Well, they don't. They simply don't. I think we have 2 legal ADUs in the York neighborhood, and all you have to do is walk down the alley and you can count quite a few more. So, Commissioner Crooks, you were talking about the question of whether somebody might game the system. A lot of gaming is going on. I don't think it would be gaming the system by potentially one of these low-income homeowners who's finally getting the chance to get a loan in a house. But there's a lot of gaming that goes on in what I would refer to as, you know, turning these single-family homes into rooming houses, completely illegal, coming into the permitting department and building in a single-family zone, basically 2 side-by-side duplexes that are connected by a laundry room. I mean, that's basically code busting and gaming of the system. So I agree, there is gaming that goes on, and it concerns me. I have some questions about the procedural changes. One of the key items that neighborhoods value is the pre-application meeting with the neighborhood. I've participated in a couple of those with you, Tom, and I think they're very valuable. It allows us to have input and just be educated about what the design is going to be and how it fits with the zoning in the neighborhood. So in these 2 proposed type 3B land use decision or type 3A land use decision, I'm not familiar enough with those to know if the neighborhood meetings are knocked out of the mix or whether they're still going to be a key component of that process. And so I'd like to have that answered. And I think there's just too much vagueness in this language that talks about usable open space, street frontage, minimum lot size, parking, lot coverage, setbacks. I think it just gives the building department permitting too much running room to kind of do with it what they want. I think the neighborhoods need some assurance and predictability about what these housing types are going to be. And I agree with what the previous speaker, Louise, said about trying to protect our single-family neighborhoods. We have very valuable historic housing stock in the city of Bellingham. And we, in our neighborhood, have worked very hard to do historic preservation. And I don't want to see that the baby thrown out with the bathwater, as it were, that we would suddenly come in and a builder would just buy up 3 or 4 contingent lots and bulldoze them to put in affordable housing, when in fact those homes could have been affordable for a family. I mean, these are 4,000 square foot lots. We're already at a density in parts of our neighborhood of, 1,500 square feet. And in the other single-family zone, it's 3,000 square feet on a 3,000 square feet per unit on a 4,000 square foot lot. We're not talking about palatial lots here. We're not talking about very many empty lots. Probably could count them on a couple of fingers in our neighborhood. So I think the neighborhood associations need to be included in this process. I have been active with IMNAC and attended a lot of the meetings there. It's a great conduit of communicating from the neighborhoods to the planning department or to the mayor's office, or just to be educated ahead of time about what we can anticipate. And I don't remember this issue coming along on the agenda at all. Neither did the subdivision discussion that you had December 18th. So we're sort of like left out of the discussion, or neighborhood reps are left out of it. And I think it's better to engage the neighborhoods now, early on, rather than just expect them to show up at a public hearing and try to, digest all of this. Let's see. So those are my questions, and thank you for the time.
Thank you, Ann. That's it for people on the list. If anyone else would like to speak, please come on down and state your name and address and tell us what you know.
My name is Isaac Post, and I live on Knox Avenue in the Happy Valley neighborhood. First, I just want a little bit of clarification about the plan. Would the housing exclude or include mixed uses for, like, if there was to be corner stores so that residents could go to them, or if and also I guess the second part to the question is, would any of it be higher density to, like, almost like townhouses / retail underneath a house sort of situation in the current plan?
Go ahead and pose the questions you've got, and then make your comments, and then when we're done, staff will, that way they can take more time to respond.
Okay,
Would that
perfect.
be okay?
Yeah,
Thank you.
of course. Yeah, I just didn't know how to do it. The second question would be, maybe I was missing something a little bit, but when you were presenting the plan showing how housing would get constrained, up on the map, like due to the quarter-mile rule and due to the historic zone, not historic, sorry, low-income zones, were there going to be any amendments made to expand the areas? Was that in the plan, or is that something to discuss heading forward? And then whether there's any form-based codes involved or whether they're all statistical. I really like the idea about accessory dwelling units that you mentioned. And the quarter mile has been brought up quite a bit. It's a very well-studied rule that Sound Transit uses, King County Metro uses, Whatcom Transit Association uses, is used by some of the most influential urban designers out there. Use this rule because they've done a ton of studies looking at when people actually walk and when people don't. And it's not actually a quarter mile or a 5-minute walk once you consider that you can't walk as the crow flies. Lots of areas are built where there's hills, so you have to walk maybe even a mile to get from one spot to the other because, for instance, like Knox Avenue to Knox Avenue has a giant hill dividing it near 21st Street. So the walking distance may appear on a map to be a quarter mile. It could actually be as much as 1.5 miles. And that increases the walking time too. The parking requirements, that was just sort of a question. I know it opens up another big can of worms, but that was my last question. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac.
My name is April Barker. I live at 3127 Birchwood Avenue, Bellingham, Washington. I've had an opportunity to work with David Stahlheim and our neighborhood as well, and I just really want to give you a shout out. He provides an excellent example of staff who is willing to take some of the tough questions and even answer them already in his document, not make the people wait to see the information. It's extremely helpful. And also an excellent example where our job is the neighborhoods is just to ask the questions. I mean, you all are the ones who ultimately make the decisions. And I've just never had a question that has been asked where it's been personal or in any other way. It's just simply a question, and it might not even be an educated one, but he's always willing to answer those. And so it's been a pleasure to work with him and to work with him with our neighborhood. So I do still have a couple of questions, and one thing I wanted to note. I went through a training seminar, and Greg Baker was there, and it was to be a Bellingham employee, public schools. And I thought it was really interesting. He's really trying to get the people to buy the neighborhood and not the school. And he's doing everything in his power, along with the school board, to ensure that whenever you come to Bellingham and you want to buy a home, you don't have to shop schools. You don't have to figure out which is the best school and the most amazing. And he wants you to come and find your unique neighborhood, because we do have such unique neighborhoods, and how important that is to people when they're purchasing something. And he's really ensuring that each of our schools, no matter how impacted they are, they're giving everybody the same opportunity. So I think it's nice that we can rely on that, and it's being highlighted even in the public school system that we need those diverse neighborhoods, the character in them. I am really a huge fan, especially after living in Birchwood and seeing some of the past kind of planning snafus, and I don't think it was purposeful at the time. I think we just didn't have a lot of foresight, and maybe we didn't have the people asking the right questions. But really creating systems that almost set people up for failure in the way that we've done housing. And I think the idea of peppering that housing into single family is just phenomenal. I just want to make sure that the questions are answered, to make sure when that happens, it's accepted very well by the neighborhood. It worries me a little bit with the 50% increase, and it's only because I'm not super educated in that. I get that for 2 homes you get a third. I don't really understand what that means for 1 home. And with the subdivision changes, I mean, we could end up changing how many people could live, like, say, in the Birchwood neighborhood. And so when somebody has a lot now that would only be 1 house, it could change to where it could be 2, and then therefore it could be this cumulative effect where you could get a lot more. So without knowing what those are going to be, I'm confused about the 50%, but I can understand where it's an incentive. Let's see. I really couldn't figure out in that document, the public process to me looked like it was taken out. So maybe if you could just make that a little more clear. I did come in a little bit late. I was at another meeting, so I just want to make sure that there is a point. And I haven't ever been to an examiner's open forum, so I'm assuming that's just put out to the public in the same way and goes out to the president and the MNAC representative. And I really want to highlight what Ann said. I attend the MNAC meetings as the president of a neighborhood association and as an alternate. And they're fabulous meetings. You get a lot of information, and it really builds a lot of community amongst the neighborhoods. But it's a shame that they're not being utilized in a way where these valuable staff hours that are going into these massive proposals that then get hit by us right now. And it just seems in the last meeting that we had, when I think it was Mrs. Bell was here, and I remember hearing about all the brown bag lunches, and I thought, oh, they had brown bag lunches? And I'm trying to figure out, who went from our neighborhood? And I realized it was only some stakeholders in those brown bag. And I think had some of us been involved in some of your neighborhoods, it would just help be more efficient and save on time, so you don't have to go back and rewrite these things, because we do have valuable input. And I think that MNAC might be a place for that. The one thing I also didn't see in here is, how is this going to be measured? When are you going to stop and take account? How are you going to decide if this was working? Sometimes we get things like the infill toolkit and it sits and it hangs out there, and then we think, hey, how are we going to move this to make people use it, instead of maybe going, this isn't working and we didn't really have a way to measure that. Maybe you did. I think that it would be great to have something added into at what point are we going to relook at this? Did it work? Did it incentivize people? Great. If it didn't, let's keep that lean process going, get this out of there, and make sure this doesn't just sit on the books for a long period of time. As far as the quarter mile, it's great that we're thinking about walkability, and we are a town of walkable and bikeable, and public transit is awesome. But I didn't read anything about amenities. So sometimes you can be very close to a bus, but you're not so close to a store or a school. And I think we've heard in a lot of the other public hearings, and I don't know what's able to cross over, but that's what people really want. They want the walkability, not just the transit access. Even for people who are needing help in getting affordable housing, they too want to have that same right to walk their kids to elementary school and to walk down to the store. So I just wondered where that was at in the whole part. I just have really enjoyed these meetings, and the more people that are coming with their educated and really thought out, I hope you guys are enjoying them as well. And thanks for the opportunity, and also thank you. I noticed that you've taken some of the suggestions to run your meetings, try them just a little bit differently, and I do appreciate you being open to that.
Thank you, April.
Wendy Harris. First of all, I would like to thank the staff for being concerned about low-income housing. It's something that the citizens are concerned about, and very clearly the residents here, we want our public funds to be spent helping to assist people that are low income, that are elderly, that are handicapped, that have problems that need assistance. What drew my attention to this in part was the fact that there were so many incentives being given to developers, private developers. And what I don't like is having public funds being used to be giving subsidies to private developers who already have money. And I think there's way too much of that in here. So the first question that I would like to ask is, we're talking about this now, but why isn't this part of the comp plan update? I mean, we're in the middle of updating our comp plan right now, and that requires a comprehensive, cooperative, broad-based review. Why aren't we including that in there? I'm concerned about the infill. I mean, I don't have to tell any of you that a lot of people in the neighborhoods don't like infill. And so I think it would be a better approach if we could pre-identify the areas for infill where we're going to allow this, instead of just saying anywhere except the Lake Whatcom watershed. So that the first clue a neighborhood has that they're not subject to these provisions is that there's a development proposal. So I would like this to be handled differently. And yes, I think one of the things that we really haven't done a good job of as a city is protecting our critical areas. And hopefully that'll be discussed at some point in the future. But for instance, when we talk about things like open space, nobody in the city really understands open space is intended in large part to provide habitat. So there's a lot of things that really need to be considered. So we need to recognize the fact that infill isn't appropriate everywhere. We don't want infill in sensitive watersheds, in areas where they're going to influence creeks that go into pocket estuaries. And we don't want them in any of our critical areas. And we don't have any habitat corridors or any wildlife management plans. So we don't even know for conservation of habitat conservation areas where those critical areas even are. So I really see that as kind of a major problem, and that's why I'm asking that this proposal exclude infill from critical areas and sensitive watersheds, so that at least if we define those later, we know that it's protected from infill under this provision. The other thing that concerns me, and this is a big concern, and people have touched on it in terms of public process, but I'm thinking more in terms of administrative discretion. Every time I see a proposal, an ordinance come before the Planning Commission and the City Council, it's granting more and more administrative discretion to the staff. And what that does is it takes power away from the public. And it's really dangerous because the type of discretion that we're providing is very broad. It doesn't even have parameters or standards of what the director should follow in exercising his or her discretion. And I'm probably maybe one of the few people here that has actually gone to hearings examiners hearings. And I can tell you, they're not well attended. If I show up, I might be the only member of the public there. And, you know, whereas there's a lot more people that watch the city council meetings, they're televised and they're put on the website so that the public can at least follow what's going. Nobody's following the hearing examiner process, even though it's important. It's not televised. There's not even, I don't think there's audio tapes. You can read the decisions that come out afterwards, but nobody's doing that. So when you grant the planning director vastly increased discretion and then change this from a city review process to a hearings examiner review process, that has some very significant impacts on due process. And one of the provisions that really concerned me the most was this allows under provision 20.27.03D unlimited discretion for the planning director to change things right before it goes to the hearing at the hearing examiner stage, when no one's even paying attention. So after the public's weighed in and you're in front of the hearings examiner, the planning director can basically say, well, I'd like to change all these standards, and I don't really know what that means. So I'd ask you to please look at the different provisions. It's really poor policy to allow the staff unlimited discretion in handling matters, because that doesn't ensure that each applicant is subject to the same standards and consistent treatment. And it doesn't ensure consistency from one administration to another. And what I've heard the development community talk about is they want consistency. And this is the opposite of consistency. It's sort of like playing Russian roulette. Maybe you'll get lucky and things are really going to go in your way, but maybe they won't. And I don't think that's in anybody's real interest to have that kind of a system. And I would also like to address this quarter-mile issue because it's come up, and I have a slightly different perspective on that because I am disabled. I am on disability. I require oxygen. And I would suspect that a much higher percentage of people that are low income are either physically disabled and handicapped or elderly. And these are the people that, I mean, a quarter mile, a half a mile isn't much to you. But I can tell you, if I walk a mile, that's a big deal for me. That's a big day. So if I was ever required to go into low-income housing because of my situation, you know, what doesn't seem like a big deal to an able-bodied person is a big deal. If you're in a wheelchair, if you're attached to oxygen, if you're elderly and frail and you can't handle the cold. So those are important considerations. And finally, I'd like to address a little more about these impact fees because I don't like the 50% density bonus. That's a lot. Here's my big concern. I'm sorry I'm rambling. We're out of developable land. I don't have to tell you that. And I'm actually in the housing market. I know that. We're in a situation where we have a lot of very expensive housing and some lower income or rental housing. And there's very little for the middle class. And you know, that's sort of a problem that also needs to be addressed, and it would be addressed better as part of this comprehensive planning process, the comp plan update that we're going through. But in terms of the impact fees, those are going to be paid for by the public. And one of the reasons I know this is I was looking at a lot of land I wanted to buy, and I went down to City Hall and I asked them about it, and they said, and it was a $50,000 lot. And they said, oh yeah, that's fine, except you have to spend $250,000 putting in roads and sidewalk. And it was only going to affect 2 homes. And I said, that's ridiculous. I mean, even to me as an environmentalist, that's ridiculous. And I said, you're making it so only big developers can come in with who have a lot of money. And they said, yes, that's what we want to do. So those impact fees are high. And under the GMA, the impact fees are for any development activity that affects public facilities, capital facilities, to the extent that the development is going to proportionately increase the demand on those capital facilities. So that includes public streets and parks. And as I explained, those streets are expensive, parks are expensive, open space, which, as I explained, involves habitat, recreational facilities, and schools. And depending on where you live, it could be fire protection facilities. But more than that, under the SEPA process, sometimes we use SEPA to impose additional impact fees on a site-specific development. And some developments require higher standards, and we require the developer to cover that through mitigation. And here's my concern. Because we're out of a lot of good developable land, what we're left with is a lot of critical areas: wetlands, steep slopes, habitat area. Well, that happens to be some of the most expensive land to develop because of the mitigation fees and the mitigation you have to do. And if we now are waiving all of the impact fees and not restricting development in those critical areas, what we're doing is actually incentivizing developers to come in and build in and infill in those critical areas, which is where we really least want to have housing, because the benefit you get from having a waiver of fees is much greater in environmentally sensitive land. And I hope that makes sense, what I'm saying, but I'm afraid of it. We're incentivizing development in sensitive land because it's more expensive to develop. So these fee waivers and these incentives mean more, the more expensive the development is. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Okay, so we've got no one else who'd like to speak and no one else signed up. So I think at this point, I'd like to ask staff if they'd like to respond to any of the comments from the public. And just to clarify this process that we're going to go through, after staff has spoken, I think we're going to have our discussion as a commission, and then we'll give an opportunity at some point. This is all new, so we're going to have to feel this out a little bit, but we'll give an opportunity for the public to clarify anything if there's anything that needs clarification. It's not going to be another opportunity to present your ideas or thoughts or repeat any comments that you previously gave us. It's just to talk about maybe if there was some confusion about, you recognize that there was some confusion amongst the commissioners about what you were trying to say or something like that, or we were misinterpreting your comments in some way. But I think we'll ask staff first to respond.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if I ever introduced myself at the beginning of this. All of a sudden I'm sitting here going, I don't remember ever doing that like Kurt did. David Stahlheim, city's block grant manager. Anyhow, I have a couple of different things that were questions and then maybe some clarifications based on the input that I'm just will ramble through here. First off is some process issues. When this ordinance was adopted back in 2004, because it was a demonstration ordinance, the whole procedural process was put into this section of code rather than reference to other sections of code. And as a result of that, when you're looking at this, it looks like we struck out the notice to the neighborhoods, for example. But that whole process of notice to neighborhoods exists in that other section of code. So neighborhoods will be informed of the applications. Everyone within 500 feet in the city gets notice of applications, and so everyone will have notice of that process, so none of that goes away. We just simplified the ordinance by making reference to another section that exists in there. The second part of that is some conversation about hearing examiner and the city council and even our new planning director and all the authority that he has. So to be clear, the current process is that the hearing and the whole record is established in front of the hearing examiner, and that in large part is the end of the public process. The city council makes the final decision, but the record is all built in front of the hearing examiner. So if you want to have your input, you either go through the neighborhood process through staff and get recommendations, or to the developer, get the project changed, or go to the hearing examiner and ask for those changes, and then the hearing examiner's record is put in front of the city council. And so really the public process has not changed irregardless of either method that we're suggesting here, either as an appeal to city council or appeal to Superior Court. The public input process of neighborhoods and your input primarily in front of the hearing examiner is staying largely the same. There isn't any more authority in this ordinance for the planning director than currently exists. In that section that Wendy was referring to, is all it is the planning director issuing a recommendation to the hearing examiner. So the planning director doesn't have any existing authority or any new authority to waive any standards under this. That whole section G is just that the planning director who's in charge of the zoning code in the city has the ability to issue a recommendation to the hearing examiner. So there's no new authority with respect to that. Here's some good input about quarter mile issues, and so a couple different things of clarification, and Wendy's input about her challenges of getting to buses because of walkability in the quarter mile reminded me actually of the other conversation. I used to work for a transit agency in Wenatchee as well, is that quarter mile is also the distance under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So paratransit is the quarter mile standard. So if you live beyond quarter mile, you will not get service for Whatcom Transit outside of a fixed route. So they won't come and pick you up if you're more than a quarter mile. So there's not only is it a standard of walkability, but it is an ADA standard as well. So she's right, anything with people with disabilities or seniors that can't walk to transit would not have any transit options beyond a quarter mile for that. Isaac mentioned, he had kind of asked a question about walkability with Knox Street connecting. And so when I showed that map, we did the real simple thing where we just buffered all the routes of a quarter mile. But the ordinance does say walkable, and so we would have to evaluate every project to determine the walkability as part of that. So that map will get more narrowly constrained when we did a project-by-project review. And so doing that full analysis would be quite a bit of GIS work to kind of do the full walkability of the city to meet that standard. But it is a walkability is the recommendation under that. There were some also comments about measuring and reporting, and so if you would like to look at your ordinance, the very last page, well, not the last page, but on page, starting at the bottom of page 9 of the draft ordinance, section 20.27050, the reporting requirements, is that the owners or developers are required to report on projects. And well, it was annually, we're now recommending every other year, and so the issue about measuring how this is doing is that we will be getting reports of how it's doing. And it also has a requirement, a monitoring provision in there about the project application must have the mechanism for us reporting and monitoring compliance. And Ms. Mackey talked about, the issue of perhaps owners coming in, but it ends up being a rental unit. Well, the reality is that that's something that we want to have reported and monitored, and we need a mechanism. We do that in any things that we fund. We monitor for homeowners actually being in the housing unit. So we monitor that, and if our funding is not involved in it, we would have to have some other mechanism proposed as part of that. And so we do have that in there, and there's a way for us to tabulate how this overall ordinance is doing and report on that. And you know, that can be made available to the public and the Planning Commission and City Council as well. The maps, Isaac kind of talked about the maps and the constraint thing, and I kind of mixed two things, so I want to be clear. Perhaps the Planning Commission understands this, but maybe not, and definitely I think it was missed on the public. When I did the transit map, that's what's in the draft ordinance, the quarter mile, and so that's the current constraint. But when I did the low-income neighborhoods and the watersheds in large measure, that was based on a quick analysis of the input that we had received to date. So that doesn't exist. The only thing that's the constraint in terms of the location is that it has to be in the zoning districts that are identified in the ordinance, and it can't be in the Lake Whatcom watershed. The reason not in Lake Whatcom watershed is the density bonus, is the additional units in that watershed. So I'm kind of apologize for having two things where I was kind of also somewhat responding to public input that we had received, and that was a little bit confusing as part of that. I think that was the large things that I wanted to make sure I responded to, and I don't know if Kurt caught anything else, and if commissioners have other questions that you want to get clarified based on input before you go on. I'd be glad to take that input. Questions?
Thanks, David. I'd like to ask the commission a question, just procedurally, how we want to handle this opportunity for the public to make another comment. Do we want to ask clarifying type questions again to staff and then have the public have an opportunity, or do we want to have our full robust discussion and then give them that opportunity? It seems like those are two different things. I don't know if anybody's thought about this.
I think we could move into our discussion and then leave that comment period if needed for after.
Okay. So I think at that, and if everyone's okay with that, then I think we'll just open it up to the commission to ask questions of staff and start our discussion. And Garrett, you want to start us off?
Yeah. Colston Land Trust is the company or the organization that's done 2 projects in Bellingham utilizing the current affordable housing.
Correct. Yeah, they're a nonprofit organization.
Do we receive any comment, feedback from that group regarding this?
We haven't. Their former director was Paul Schisler, and so he sent a letter in today, and his comments had to do with the quarter mile standard, and also that the mix of market rate and affordable housing, he suggested to get closer to the Bellingham mix at 51% is.
As opposed to 75?
Correct. And he did like the permanent affordability. So 3 different things he had in his letter that we just got today.
Their recommendation was to maintain the permanent?
Correct.
What you identified that as being a hindrance to other parties that need to obtain financing, because banks don't want to loan.
Yeah, I mean, I can't envision a scenario where a private developer would come in with a project to do permanent affordability for a project, because they can't assure that. They wouldn't be able to get financing, unless they did the same thing where they separated and someone owned the land and someone owed the improvements.
What are the resale restrictions? I mean, this has been referenced in there, so can you break that down on how that works after these units are built?
Yeah, so the resale restrictions are that when the units are built, they have to be sold to another low-income family that earns less than 80% of area median income.
And then they want to turn around and sell it. Is there restrictions that run in perpetuity with that property? Say they own it for 3 years and they want to resell it?
Correct, yeah. So under the proposal, we would have a 50-year, so the resale restrictions would go for 50 years. Under Culshan model, that's in perpetuity for that. Just somewhat of a side thing is that under the funding programs like Culshan has and the city has for home ownership, is that people are allowed to continue to gain some equity in their homes, and so they see it, maybe not what the market is doing. So they may not gain as much appreciation in their house. Quite often not. Almost always probably not, actually, to be really honest. But they do get some appreciation in the price that they'll get, so they won't sell it for the same amount that they bought it for. But then it has to be, so it's set up as a program where then it is affordable to another low-income family as a result.
So the restriction's not related to the price of the home, it's to the demographic or the income level of the people that you can sell it to.
Yeah,
restricting the buyers.
Yeah, they're a little bit tied together because the affordability, you'll go through the thing is that someone that earns, $48,000 a year can afford 30% of their income towards housing costs, and so they can only afford that much for that, and so that kind of starts setting your sales price for what that would be. Okay. So yeah, so you kind of go through that of the standard is 30% of your income or your housing costs towards that. It kind of starts to set the value for that.
Just one last question. Who's responsible for regulating or ensuring that those sale restrictions are being met 10 years later after the project's, maybe that unit's been sold 2 times?
So in this ordinance, that's where I was pointing on page 10 of the ordinance, is that the way that we wrote it is that the project application decision must specify the mechanism for reporting and monitoring compliance. So we haven't specified the procedure in here. If it was a project that came through our program, we actually have a covenant, we have a lien on the property, and so we monitor that compliance of the resale. All the resales come through our office and we sign off on all those, we review all the income. But the reason we didn't do that in here is there may be different models if we had other developers involved. And so we said, just come with a program that can work of how we are going to monitor it.
Okay.
And that's going to have to be part of the application and the approval package.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but there has to be something in place. There has to be some kind of covenant, some kind of reporting requirement.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick follow-on question to that? I'm a little confused. So you could be a developer and build a project, say, with 10 homes and sell all of those to third parties, and then why would you be concerned about what happened 47 years later? Because you're out of the game at that point, and the person who stands to get the windfall at year 50 is actually like potentially the 10th or 20th or 5th low-income owner, right?
Right.
So why would a 50-year versus a permanent affordability requirement have any impact on the developer? Because in all likelihood, he's going to be long gone unless it's a land trust type situation by the time that 50-year period runs out. I guess I'm just confused about why that would impact financing.
The permanent affordability?
Versus a 50-year, because they both seem like so far out that the guy acquiring the financing at the beginning is probably not involved anymore. Does that make sense? The confusion?
Well, because there's going to be a covenant on the property, and so so we're at the beginning of construction here, and we're trying to get funding for the project, and so you're going to go to the bank and say, I'm guaranteeing that this house that I'm building that has a 50-year lifespan will be affordable to low-income families in perpetuity. And so I don't think you'll find any financing to build your project.
Do you think the bank will say, that doesn't generate enough profit for me over the long term?
There's no assurance. Yeah, the outcome is not a good one.
There's no assurance that the value of the home will increase the way the bank might want it to over time, effectively?
Yeah. But kind of another thing that's kind of interesting in part of your question is that, at the end of 50 years is that there is a potential where that separation is that last owner could potentially see something. And so, setting up a mechanism of shared appreciation, some other things of, what happens during that period of time, because, if the market goes up at the end of 50 years is that house all of a sudden could now be sold for $500,000 that's only 175,000 today, type of thing. So that could be the case. So whoever's in it in year 40 probably wants, or 30 probably wants to stick around for a long period of time. So that is a little bit of a shortcoming of having that as a time limit.
And then, in the same vein, if there's a permanent reporting requirement, that's what your comment made me think about, and you develop a project and then you sell all the homes in the project, you could potentially be on the hook for the next 45 years to be responsible for reporting unless you came up with some sort of other program to like pass that on to the homeowner or something.
Yeah, well, pass down to the homeowner or some organization to monitor that. And so, I mean, we could set up, you know, if the city's in the system to monitor that, I would assume that we would talk about collecting a fee for that service where we would, you know, review the income and qualified people. They could actually do it through a bank, you know, through other financing, some other things that they would have. So there's different ways to kind of set that up.
Okay.
Because, yeah, if it's a private developer, my assumption is that they're going to sell the homes, they're out of it. And that's why we want those types of things to be worked out so that we don't have that people take advantage of the incentive and then 3 years later, you know, they flip the property and it's not affordable anymore and got the density bonus.
That makes sense. Steve?
One thing, I don't know if it's beyond the scope of this ordinance or not, but let's say you have a homeowner that acquires a property, low income. I don't see anything in this ordinance that takes that homeowner, probably that person has a lesser education than the mean out there in the neighborhood. It would be lower. What kind of educational process is there available if it's just on the side, or why isn't it included in this ordinance that helps people understand the obligations of home ownership? Just to congratulate them and give them a key, to me, that's asking for problems. And I think there should be some kind of a social means to assist any new homeowner, first-time homeowner, in getting through and understanding all the obligations of home ownership.
Yeah, that's a good common question. Anything that we fund in our program actually does require home buyer counseling as a condition of that. And so, yeah, that is a good standard for anybody to go through home buyer counseling, and particularly for first-time home buyers that have never done that, to make sure they understand the issues of maintenance and savings accounts and predatory lending practices, all kinds of different things that are covered in some basic home buyer things. We cover that in our stuff. It's not in here. It certainly wouldn't be, people offer that course here free. I mean, you certainly, if you think that's important, you could add that as probably a requirement. That would not be a burden to any project, to have home buyer counseling as a required element to this.
I would like to pursue that, and I'll offer an amendment at this time that be a requirement for any potential homeowner if they have not held ownership in a single-family unit or even a multifamily, that they go through some type of home ownership counseling in preparation for taking the keys.
Is that a motion?
That's a motion.
Excuse me, Chairman. I think prior to making an amendment motion, you might want to make a motion to consider the ordinance before trying to motion to amend it.
Agreed. Why don't we do this? We're still having discussion. Let's hold that, if that's okay, Steve, and then we'll just bring it back up once we actually get into the motion.
Yeah, that's
okay,
fine.
Thanks.
Yes, I just have a question. If we find that even in our best intents, things go terribly wrong, is this undoable?
No, any ordinance that you can create, you can uncreate. So.
Right, but that would be for future behavior, not necessarily for what's already in the pipeline. I mean, I'm just trying to envision somebody getting a home and then opening it up to, y'all come and live here, or is there any Is there anything that if we find that it's not working well, there could be intervention?
Well, again, kind of the idea of monitoring compliance is, that's the thing that we have in there about reporting and monitoring compliance. The way we do it in our funding thing is we have covenants on the property that has consequences to that, and so if they violate the covenants, the city has the right to enforce that covenant. And so I would anticipate that we would be doing the same thing here, that, you know, we expect, this is a home buyer thing, we expect the owners to live in the house. It's their principal residence. It's not a rental. And that's one of the monitoring things that we would want to make sure that happens.
But that sounds like somebody is going to be paying for some oversight then. And if the developer is long gone, I'm just wondering what entity steps in there. I guess I was a little hazy on what the answer on that one.
Yeah, and sorry to be a little bit hazy, because I think it might differ based on differing projects, and so we said part of the application needs to have that process proposed. I can tell you, if we were the funder in it, we actually, the city, because the housing levy that was passed was only for 7 years, we actually charge a monitoring fee for that, and we collect it and we put it in a fund so that at the end of the levy, we are sure that there's funds for the city to carry on that monitoring compliance. And so we have that in place for us to do that compliance in the future. I would anticipate that that would be the same things if we weren't the funder, that we would want to make sure some similar financial thing would be in place to ensure compliance in the future.
But if you're looking at 50 years out, that could be a lot of fees for setting up compliance observation.
Yeah, home buyer
Trying to
compliance
look at the
is
logistics.
not quite as difficult because it's not as much turnover typically. First off, rental compliance in our realm is more because the rental units turn over more. But the home buyers, you have to check for income only at the change of sale. You would be notified whenever the sale is happening, so you would know about that and you'd be able to check that and approve that. The biggest probably potential labor thing is making sure that the homeowner is in there, and there's ways to do that by checking utility records, you know, other things there to make that compliance fairly cost effective.
Did you have a comment? I just had so right now the proposal is to have 75% requirement for affordable housing.
Correct.
And it seems to me, you know, just looking at this, you know, it seems really complicated. You know, there's a lot of, obviously people that do this kind of work have to have experience in this kind of work. They have to provide mechanisms for monitoring. They have to be able to try to predict what financing will or won't do over a 50-year period. And, you know, the history of this has only been done twice in 10 years, so it's not something that, you know, people are beating down the doors to do. The only feedback that we've received from anybody who's done this is suggesting a 50% requirement for affordable housing, so 25% lower than what's proposed here. Is there a reason why you guys are proposing a higher amount?
You know, it was a conversation that we had. I think that one of the risks of doing lower amount, if you go to 50 or 51%, is that we're also providing a 50% density bonus as a result of providing affordable housing. And so if you actually, then you are incentivizing more things as a result of you know, that's not low income there. So that's part of the reason to have it there. I think the point of having some mix there is well taken, but you could also, in a development project, separate this ordinance off from another part, and so you could have market rates. So you could have a larger project. There could be just kind of two phases to it, and do some other things there. But you wouldn't have the density bonus apply to if you had it at 51% there. So it's not a hard and fast thing. There's certainly leeway to move in between. A lot of the things that I've seen in some of the mixes is that You know, there's sweet spots of having a mixed income things, and we didn't get into the real details of a lot of mix in here, but you could do different things if you wanted to.
Well, I guess my question is if this goes, you know, basically from we move tonight to make this a permanent, you know, ordinance as opposed to something that's revisited every several years, you talk about finding that balance and that sweet spot. What if it's not 75%? You know, is there a chance to revisit that? The whole idea is that you said this at the beginning of the meeting, is try to get this to work. It seems like you're, you know, lowering that requirement from 100% to 75% to try to make it more incentive for people to do it.
Yeah, so that, so if we don't get more, then you could look at changing that number again as a result of things. So I don't have a really good answer for you there. I don't know what that sweet spot is until we kind of find that. But if we go to 51%, we're going from 100% down to 51%, and that's a pretty big leap for that, with understanding that you're getting a 50% density bonus for providing, 51% of the units is affordable. So,
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that, as you heard tonight, as you've seen in your agenda, as we've talked about it from staff of what's coming forward for potential hearings or for potential planning commission evaluation, is we're dealing with a zoning code it was drafted in 1982. We're dealing with a subdivision ordinance code that was drafted in 1997. We have a lot of codes on our books that have been there for a really long time. One of the things that we're trying to do in kind of proactive planning is to actually look at the codes that we have on our books now, and are they working? And if they're not working, why aren't they working, and can we do something to change that? I think you're going to see that becoming common. It's through this lean philosophy that we're looking at. Is you want to get out there, you want to plan, do, check, adjust. You know, adjustment of these things is key. And so this is one of the opportunities that we've had. We've got an existing code that's been on place. As David mentioned earlier, this code no longer exists. It expired December 31st, 2014. The past councils have said, they've given us direction to make this permanent. We're bringing forward this permanent change. We're trying to make small tweaks to evaluate those tweaks as we go to make sure that they're working. So part of our overall process as planners is making sure that we have good codes in place that support our comprehensive plan. That is what this does. This is supporting goals and policies of our comprehensive plan now, and most likely future comprehensive plans as well. So I guess I just want to add some assurances that that's something that we should be doing to all of our codes, is evaluating these to make sure that they're working, and we intend to do that in the future as well.
Can I ask a question, Kurt? What kind of process is there for, quote, tweaking this after it is code? I mean, does it come again before City Council and the entire thing gets rewritten, or do you just say we're going to strike that 75% and make it 65%? What would be the process, theoretically?
I think the process is we as public servants need to ensure, and as also required by the Growth Management Act, to ensure that our development regulations institute our comprehensive plan goals and policies. So there are a lot of development regulations out there, and we need to constantly be looking at these. Ways to change the code are, I guess, the identified way in our code. The code can be changed 3 ways. The City Council can initiate a change, the Planning Commission can initiate a change, or the Planning Director can initiate the change. Now, what we've seen in the past is that we've had code changes initiated by the Planning Director that have been actually requested by the public. So if the public finds that a code is not working for them, or a developer finds that a code is not working for them, they have the opportunity to come to either the Planning Director the Planning Commission or the City Council to request that that code change be initiated. So there's multiple opportunities in different ways for entities to change the code.
Cerise?
One question was about mixed use. Is there an opportunity? I mean, I know you were talking about different incomes, but with mixed use, so having a retail component or something in this?
I don't think that allows it.
Currently, as written, it does not allow for that. Again, the goal is affordable housing, not mixed use. Interesting concept, though.
Yeah, I'd be a little hesitant to allow that kind of stuff in single family. I mean, mixed use could be anything. It could be a chicken farm next door or something, you know. It's just going down a street that I don't want to go down, I think.
It's okay to be open to change.
Kurt, this is permitted in a residential single-family or multifamily zone is what this ordinance says. Right. Does that mean that, like, in a planned commercial zone where residential multifamily development is permitted use, it would not be allowed because it's not a residential multifamily zone? I'd like some clarity about where this actually would apply zoning-wise.
That's correct. It is allowed in single-family zones or multifamily zones.
RM or RS zones only?
Correct.
Okay. And so if you were in an RM zone that had a mixed-use qualifier and you proposed a project, could you not include a commercial component in the project because that would be a permitted use in the RM zone? And that's kind of like maybe like a little microcosm of what could happen. But you know what I mean? Like, let's say you're in an RM zone that has a mixed-use qualifier. It allows some level of commercial component, and you propose a 10-lot subdivision with a little corner store, which would be permitted under the zoning.
Yeah, no, I think that that's correct.
Probably doesn't happen very often.
We don't have too many of those mixed zones. Some of our residential multi-plan zones allow like an eating establishment associated with it, so it's possible actually that could come through. Keep in mind that there are design standards that would be associated with the single-family homes as well going into that.
But that would be only in RM zone, SFR zone.
Correct. Would not be allowed in single-family zones.
Go ahead, Cerise.
Another question, I guess, would to staff, but also to the commission is there, are you guys recommending A or B, or you're just open to either A or B alternative?
And which A or B are you referring to? The ordinance A or B, or the options A or B?
The procedure.
We originally drafted this with what we call alternative A, which is the 3B procedure with appeals to City Council. But again, I think our city attorney would really like you to consider the other option as the recommendation.
I think that's a good point to talk about. Between the two are alternatives for the approval procedure. This goes to hearing. Both of them start at the hearing examiner. What's the criteria that the hearing examiner uses to review the projects?
So the criteria the hearing examiner uses is everything that's in this ordinance. So the process, including particularly the design standards there of how it fits within the neighborhood. So you're looking at how it fits. You're going to have to go through a neighborhood approval, review process ahead of that. So working through all those things within section 030, we're looking at the qualifications of the applicant, the home ownership, the guarantee of affordability, the location of it, design review, then the particular modifications that they have for that is the things that the hearing examiner would have for criteria.
And so when they're reviewing it, they're building their findings of fact, they're coming up with their conclusions of law. I think, this is an important, reason why, this becomes a legal document once she makes her findings, and having it go to City Council, I'm a bit, my concern would be that, in an appeal process or in building the findings to support, if somebody's putting together a project, they're obviously going to have a lot of investment into this by the time it goes to the hearing examiner, because they have to, the burden of proof is on the applicant that they're meeting all this criteria, and that they would anticipate by the time it gets to that point and that investment's been made, that it's getting reviewed on fact of law, not on political leanings. And I think that's a big, concern. I think that's the big distinction between these two alternatives. So that's my thoughts on that.
Well, I'd like to ask just a couple quick clarifying questions. Does anybody else have something? Did you have another comment, Bruce? And then maybe suggest that we take a quick break, if that's okay with everybody, and then give the public, if there are any clarifying comments, and then continue, maybe close the public hearing at that point, and then continue our discussion. I just have a couple quick ones following on that multifamily element. This is single family. It's allowed in the multifamily zone, but it's applicable only for single family housing types, correct? And I guess maybe following on that, what is that? What could you do with this? Could you do a duplex? Could you do a townhouse project with 10 attached townhouses? Could you do a threeplex or a fourplex? Is there any distinction there?
Well, you can do the things that meet the design review requirements. So when you look at section E on page 4 of the draft ordinance, so those are the design standards, and the whole idea behind those design standards is that it looks like a single-family home. So I think there are some abilities to do some attached things in that and some other things, but you're still going to have to deal with the orientation to the street, garages, front porches, things like that doesn't look like apartment building, frankly. So
but
you're going to have
it's
to
not
walk through those
explicit.
design.
It's not explicitly restricting you to say single-family homes and detached single-family homes and say duplexes, or detached single-family homes, duplexes, and triplexes, or anything like that. I mean, could you come in and propose a fiveplex that looked like a house in an RM zone?
I think there's potential. I think you're going to start getting a lot of feedback from the neighborhood
difficult
as part of that, and then whether or not it really meets this intent of these design standards. I think that would be challenging to do that.
Yeah.
I think it's possible. A good designer could perhaps do something, but I think that would honestly probably be pretty challenging to do something like that.
Okay, and then some people talked about one lot. If you have one lot and it meets the minimum density, you're not using this ordinance because you only get a half of a density out of that. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
So you really have to have two to start with to even get in the game with this. So really, we're probably protected against like the proliferation of subdivision of single-family lots that meet the minimum density.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I wouldn't, we had one project for 3 units that Culshan did, and then they had to go through land division to short plat to create 3 separate lots for each one of those, and so they had a lot of work just to get to that stage.
Okay, and then the last question I have is these minimum restrictions or development regulations that you can vary from. It just says that you can vary from the minimum lot size, street frontage, parking, et cetera, but there's no cap. So in theory, could you propose a project with no parking or no setbacks or no open space if you wanted to, and then that would be evaluated against by the hearing examiner, I guess?
Yeah, there are no, it allows for that. It's not going to be a project that's going to move forward without having anything to meet some of those things. You're going to have to address those issues in some way. Every project is going to have some kind of parking requirements.
Sure. But it does give you that full flexibility.
It is written as full flexibility right now, correct?
Okay. Well, that's it. Do we want to take a break, you guys, and then see if there's any public, or maybe we should just ask the question now. Is there anything that anyone who spoke would like to clarify? Looks like a couple people. So again,
Can we also ask a question? Can you clarify, you could ask me
this is going to be tricky because what we're not trying to encourage is a long, drawn-out debate between public or staff. Or, yeah, I understand that, but if you do have a clarification that requires you to ask a question, of course, and I think we would like to limit people's comment time here. This isn't a chance to present a big theory, so it's 1 or 2 minutes max to ask your questions, clarify your points, and then we'll move forward. And I have a timer if. Yeah, and I think with this, just starting out, we're going to hold people to that time. So if you guys would like to do that from the public, please come forward. Wendy, if you want to go first, that's fine. And then we'll just move through everybody, take a break, come back, and close the public hearing.
Just very quickly, clarifying on the point of whether to have appeal to the City Council or to Superior Court. As someone who's been involved in appeals, I can tell you that it's not always the developer that appeals. Sometimes it's citizens, and there's a huge difference in expense between, so when you are appealing to the City Council, that's something average citizens can afford. If you're going to Superior Court, you need an attorney. It's very expensive. So I'd ask you to consider that. And then I had a couple of questions. How many other programs are available for low-income housing? Because once I realized that this program wasn't for part of the low-income levy that was approved, that I realized, okay, so that must be used in a different program. So what other avenues do we have available to address low-income housing?
Do you want me to respond, or how do you want to handle it?
Did with Isaac's comments, and just post any questions you have, and when you're done, I'll answer
I
them
just
all.
want to know if there's other programs and what they are. And I also wanted clarification that for the incentives we're providing, it applies only to the low-income development side, so that if you have 25% that isn't subject to income limits, I just wanted to make sure there was clarity that you don't get the incentives for the non-income restricted housing. Thank you. Oh, and I really want to thank you for doing this. It is wonderful to see public process moving in the opposite direction. I've seen it moving, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, April Barker, 3127 Birchwood Avenue. I just wanted clarification toward the lien process of making sure that there's something in place where this either dumps or continues on. Once an ordinance is in place, it can be difficult. We have to go through this process again. And although I do see where there's checks and balances to make sure somebody is holding the home, I still don't understand. I don't see a clause in there to say if nobody does this in 2 or 3 years, I don't even know how you do that at the city level. So that was a clarification. And as you guys were talking, I just started thinking after we went through all of these foreclosures, and I realized not many of these will probably be built, but for those of us that paid $300 or more for our homes, and a home is only selling for $150,000 next door, how is that going to work with our appraisals? And I just, when we build community, it's really important that we need to make sure we don't divide the community with giving somebody more, but I do think we do need to assist, and that's very important. So just a point.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. I'm really confused about the design review process. Currently, there's no neighborhood review of a design if it's a single family. So will this apply only to this low-income, affordable house that's going to be built, that the neighborhood can be involved in the review process of that design? Or will this now be expanded to any new single-family home that's being built in the neighborhood? So to me, that's a really big change, and I'm confused about that. Second question is, we have sections of the city and within our neighborhood, York, that are that receive a 10-year tax incentive to encourage development. And in fact, that includes, I believe, all of the Sandwich Way Urban Village, and sections of that are in York. So that's a development incentive, different than the incentives that you're now putting forward. Are these housing units, can they be built and also receive that 10-year tax relief if they're in the same zone? So if you could clarify whether, I think the commissioner who asked, I think it was Ally who asked, where specifically are these planned for? And the concept of the urban village that hasn't been addressed at all. Do these, I mean, how does this proposal dovetail into those areas of the city that have been defined for urban village development? Thanks.
Thank you.
I think there was a little bit of confusion with what I meant by mixed use. So I just want to clarify, not chicken farms, but looking at compatible uses, such as a corner store or retail that supports the inhabitants of the area. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you, David, Kurt, do you want to respond to some of those questions before we break?
I'll take some of them, and I think Kurt probably needs to cover a few of these. So one of the questions, start off the top, is how many low-income programs are there? So again, this is a zoning ordinance, an incentive for zoning, and so it's possible that people will come in and they don't ask for any funding from any government entity whatsoever as part of this. And that's a little bit what the incentive is trying to do, is try to find ways to create affordable housing without public subsidy. And so that's a little bit of part of the outcome that you try to do with incentives, is that incentivize people to do projects and to provide affordable housing and trade to have density bonuses. In terms of how many other low-income programs, I mean, the city has a housing levy, the state has funding programs, a housing trust fund, federal government has money, first-time home buyer programs through private mortgage lenders, a whole bunch of things to help incentivize home buyers that are totally outside of our area of interest, or not area of interest, but our control, all of which could participate in a program like this, a development project. Wendy had a comment or question about the incentives only apply to low income. Again, this is a zoning ordinance. The GMA language is, when the growth management was passed, it was to, in large measure, not when growth management was passed, when the affordable housing incentive section of growth management was passed, it was, the intention was to prohibit local governments from having mandatory requirements for affordable housing. And so the whole section is set up to say, if you are going to require affordable housing, you have to provide incentives to compensate for that. And so that whole section provides some guidelines, but really this ordinance isn't that, because we're not mandating affordable housing. This is entirely asking people to do affordable housing. We happen to try to mirror the things with the income and the 50-year affordability requirements, but it's a different context of what's that provision of growth management was set up for, which was to say if local governments mandated affordable housing as a regulatory control, they could only do that if they incentivized their zoning ordinance. I'll do the 10-year tax incentive thing that Ms. Mackey had, was that only applies for 4 units or more. It's a multifamily, so this is not applicable to that part of it. And maybe, Kurt, I don't know if you want to talk about the lien and the design review process applicability.
Sure. The design review process, the design review criteria that are put in here apply to the entire project. So it's not going to apply to just a standard single-family house. So we're not proposing single-family design review standards for everything. We're just suggesting design review for single-family homes in this program, in this project. Secondly, the comments about the lien, I think April noted, you know, if nobody does anything, then what? I think one of the things that we're trying to do, as can be seen here, is we have one successful project. We have one other project that's underway now. So 2 in 10 years, that's not too great. So what we're trying to do here is take a small step in making a change that will hopefully create more affordable housing units for folks in our community. So one of the mechanisms as part of this ordinance requires the monitoring. Again, if the monitoring is coming back and we're only seeing 1 or 2, the director, again, one of those opportunities that can come back in and change this. Every other year we're going to have these monitoring reports, so that will help us understand and keep a good idea on these projects to whether or not they're working or not, and allow the planning director or the planning commission or the city council to make proposed changes again.
Thank you, Kurt and David. I think it's been 2.5 hours. Let's take a quick break and come back in 10 minutes. Sound good? And then we'll have a bigger discussion. Oh, I guess we should do that now, yeah. I think that we should close the public hearing at this point. And do we need to do that formally other than just let everyone know that we're closing the public hearing? I'm closing it. So we'll come back in 10 minutes and talk about this more. And thank you everyone for staying through all of this. think our 10 minutes is up. Oh, is my mic on? Do I have a gavel? Let's get Kurt down here. Okay, everyone, thank you. We'll call the meeting back to order here, and commissioners discuss motions, questions for staff, continued questions for staff. Let's proceed. Anybody?
So you, there would be no restriction to something like Habitat for Humanity, or I think it's USDA self-help homes coming in with a project under this document. Is that correct?
Part of that is correct. Habitat would have be able to do that. USDA self-help is actually only available in non-urban areas, and so they don't qualify in Bellingham. So
well, that's a stupid rule.
Yeah, it's their funding source, and so I mean they can go in other urban areas of Whatcom County. They're doing projects in Ferndale and other places, but Bellingham is declared a metropolitan area, so they're not able to do that. So yeah, we're metropolitan.
So is there another agency that could do something like self-help that you're aware of? I'm just
well, some funds that HUD has that actually Culshan is able to get access called SHOP funds, and I think that's can't remember what the acronym stands for. Sorry, but I think that is a little bit of a similar program that they have, but not as robust as the self-help program that USDA has in areas.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. In the section F 20 on page 5, going back here, 2027-030F, request for regulatory modification, where the applicant makes their request. It says request for modification must be accompanied by detailed supporting documentation regarding the appropriateness of and the need for the modification. So that to me appears to be like the only place where you quantify in some way or qualify your request, and it's very subjective. And I'm wondering what an applicant would have to do to prove the appropriateness and need for the modification. Do they have to give you a financial statement that shows that the project doesn't pencil without it, or I guess I'm curious what would satisfy the city on that criteria. What makes a modification appropriate and necessary?
Well, I think the different requests for modification, the answer is different for each one of them probably, but I'll take the easy one, and that would be parking requirements. So the request for modification is the size of the homes, the number of bedrooms, the population there, that they're targeting different things, and so that the parking standards are different than what's needed there. So I think they just have to walk through each one of these and kind of talk about what is the need for that modification. Lot size, clearly, in order to have a density bonus, they're probably going to have to modify the lot size requirements. And so these are just the things that you'll be able to get through. Yeah, it's somewhat subjective, but I mean, that would be part of the process that they're going to have to justify in front of the neighborhood in the process, and then in front of the hearing examiner. Like if they wanted to propose side yard setbacks of 0, and the neighbor doesn't think 0 is a good idea, their justification for it better be pretty good, I would think, in order to get that. So I wouldn't see the financial end of things as being something, however. I wouldn't see us necessarily getting the financial things, because this isn't an application for funding as much, so I wouldn't see the financial justification as much as being a need in this.
Like
this
character
narrative.
Context, how does it work?
Yeah, I think it's more, to me, I read this as being more of the neighborhood context of how it's going to fit in and why do you need this modification to make this project work? What are the innovative design issues that you're trying to achieve that the traditional look at the zoning for setbacks and lot size and frontage requirements don't work for you?
Okay.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to that is that what this program allows for is it allows for us to really look at comprehensively the project as a whole, as how that all fits. So when we're looking at, a reduced setback, a standard setback for a single-family home, 5 feet, is there a smaller setback that still meets fire safety, life, health, safety codes and rules and regulations, the building code, that would allow for these houses to be a little bit closer? Those are the types of things that we're looking at, and we look at it as an entire project, not as an individual house. So how is it all working overall? A really good example, and David mentioned the parking, Mathai Place, that's a good one. Our current code requires that all parking be on site. So that means you create a lot, you have to have that parking on that lot, that individual lot. Mathai Place has a larger parking area that's off to the side. So all the parking for the entire development is not on site on each individual lot. It's actually off to the side. So it allows us that flexibility to evaluate the project as a whole and the impacts as a whole instead of individually.
Thank you.
Did you guys look at how this impacts like the size and scale of project? So the way I look at this with the 75% requirement of affordable housing, if somebody had a smaller project, say 2 lots, it would without it being closer to like 50%, I don't know that they'd be able to do it. It almost seems like this is just driven towards more units. Have you looked at that as opposed if somebody had, 2 lots and wanted to make one an affordable housing, how would they do that under this current ordinance?
Yeah, and I can certainly, if you want to see this up on a screen, I did do some calculations of some examples. I did a how about if I do that? I'll just pop this up so I can read numbers. See if I can do this 2 times. The 2 projects that I have here, the lower example here is if the existing density is 4 units and 75% is affordable, so the density bonus is 4 units as a base, density bonus is 2, you get to do 6 units. The number of affordable units would have to be 5 and 1 market rate unit here. If you had a bigger project, 15 units, the density bonus would be 7, 22 units total. 17 would be affordable and 5 market rate units. I did some calculations based on the earlier input of more being affordable, including the existing ordinance right here. The existing ordinance is 100% affordable. I did it earlier on a spreadsheet and I failed to bring it along with me. I did the 51% as well. But so kind of getting to your thing about the 4 is that's how, for the smaller projects, that's how something would be. And I think the one on Lafayette that Culshan just did, I think the existing density was 2 and they got the density bonus, and so they got to 3 for that project.
In that case, all 3 units would need to be affordable because 2 out of 3 is only 66%.
In that case, it was under the existing ordinance that required 100%, but it would be, and also that's their model is that they're all affordable. And we have funding in that, and we also require them all to be affordable, so.
I had one other quick question for Kurt on the whole zoning. Someone brought up urban villages. So some of our urban villages have different kind of zoning styles. We have this new table, commercial transition, residential transition, but within those zones, there's a variety of use types permitted. So for example, in Fairhaven, you can do single-family homes. You can do the infill toolkit, you can do apartments, and whichever housing type you choose to build, then the applicable code applies. So if you choose to build single-family homes, you build subject to the residential single rules. You know what I mean? And if you choose to build an apartment on that property, you would be subject to the residential multi rules. So would these be allowed in urban villages because of that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that was one thing that I forgot to comment on. Ms. Mackey's note is when you look at it, if I had to make a call on the go, I would have to say that no, they would not be allowed in urban villages at this point because of the way that it's written. A residential single family or multifamily zone, and our urban villages are not residential single zones. They're urban village zones that have residential transition areas in them. We do have other incentives, as Ms. Mackey noted, for affordable housing in those areas as well. We've also got the multifamily tax exemption program that's also allowed in there. So there are some other opportunities, but to answer your question, no, it's possible if we wanted to look at that in there, that could be a suggestion to add or to at least clarify if you wanted them to be in urban village zones.
I'm just curious.
Would that complicate things too much?
Possibly.
I like things simple because I'm just a,
Simple would be to allow the existing urban village codes, incentives to apply in urban villages and to allow these to apply in single-family zones and multifamily zones. That's simple.
I have a suggestion for us, because we have to make a decision on the process alternative, that we discuss that and make a decision on that before we make a decision or try to have a motion on the full ordinance, because that way our motion on the full ordinance can incorporate whatever decision we've made on the alternative. So if everyone's okay with that, I wouldn't mind us talking about that or having a motion on that topic first, if we can do that, because Kurt, I know it's not, it's kind of a sub part of this. It just seems like a more logical approach than trying to do it on the back end. If that's okay with everybody. So does anybody have any comments on that or thoughts on, I know Garrett, you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I kind of expressed my thoughts on the procedures. I'd move to include alternative B as the approval procedure, that the process would go to the hearing examiner and would not be reviewed by city council. Any appeal would go to Superior Court.
Is that a motion?
I would second that.
So we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on that?
Yes. Actually, I think that's not a bad idea. I know that there's concerns about affordability and so on that we've talked about, but it seems to me that if you're coming back to city council, it's sort of an in-house thing where this takes it outside the previous decision-making process and has some fresh eyes on it. And I think there could be some value in that. For all the other downsides, I think there could be value in having someone who's not been involved thus far. Thank you.
Steve?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Since we're talking about an ordinance, we're talking about law. Take it out of the political arena. City council has a full plate anyway, and I would support alternative B as in boy.
I also support that, and actually there was a comment from someone in the public that talked about inconsistencies, giving power to the planning director and, creating inconsistencies in administration of the ordinance and creating inconsistency in how this thing is interpreted. And I think staff pointed out that we're not actually giving any new power to the planning director in that regard, but that same argument could be made with the council, that we have new council members all the time, and so there's the risk that a council could just decide they don't like affordable housing. I know that's probably not going to happen, but it creates less predictability. And speaking to your issues about the legality of things, and in an appeal stage, it just seems like taking the politics out of it is, I agree with you, Garrett. It's probably a good thing, so support that.
But all our ordinances come down the political pipeline.
They do, and then they're set, and then maybe, they should get a third set of eyes if there's a specific appeal. I don't know. That's just where I'm at.
But I do take Ms. Harris's comment that somebody, a member of the public without deep pockets, would be left standing in the cold if it goes to Superior Court. If they wanted to appeal it, they've got to hire a land use shark attorney to go after the applicant, and that just it bothers me.
We do have that. I mean, that's true. It's definitely a fair concern. I think we do have that process in place for, say, a conditional use permit. Is that correct? Where a conditional use is appealed to Superior Court, not the council. Is that true, Kurt?
That's correct.
So, and I think there's other processes as well where you have the same issues. Like someone applies for conditional use, the neighborhood doesn't like it, maybe, or an individual next door doesn't like it. That hearing examiner decision goes to Superior Court. So I feel like we have precedent for similar type projects to go through that process. I mean, I do recognize that concern. I just feel like, we do this a lot and send things to Superior Court. And if it's really, really important, maybe a group of people could band together or something to oppose it. That's my thought.
I think maybe just to help your discussion, on page 11, if you want to look at the existing houses or the existing applications that actually go to appeal to City Council, so we have very few. Most of our appeals do go to Superior Court after they've gone through their process. The appeals that currently go to City Council are applications for preliminary plat approval for subdivisions exceeding 9 lots, applications regarding 5 to 9 lot cluster subdivisions, and 2 to 4 lot cluster subdivisions with density bonuses, and then variances from the terms of our subdivision code relating to preliminary plats, 2 and 4 lot clusters with density bonuses, and 5 to 9 lot clusters. So those are the existing appeals that the City Council hears now.
What if someone proposed a 10-lot affordable housing subdivision and they used the long plat process and that was appealed? Would an appeal of the affordable housing component go to Superior Court and an appeal of the subdivision go to council? So an opponent could choose which approval to appeal? Sorry, it's probably, again, a weird situation, but that I could see that happening. Someone could do a 10-lot plat through this program.
Yeah.
Does this ordinance trump the,
No, typically you have to exhaust all of your administrative appeals before you go to Superior Court, so this would most likely, it would roll with the preliminary plat appealing to City Council.
That adds a little bit of protection.
That's my non-attorney.
Yeah, where's Alan? Do we have any more discussion? We do have a motion in a second. Okay, let's have a vote. All those in favor of, do I need to restate the motion? The motion was to choose alternative B procedure for this ordinance. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
Me.
And the motion passes 5-1. So with that, do we have any other discussion on the full ordinance? Any questions, any motions on that topic?
Well, you mentioned something about adding a housing education in there?
But we'd have to pass the ordinance first. and
Right.
then I'll do an amendment.
Yeah, I think we
Okay.
have to make the full motion
Okay.
first.
I guess the only other thing that I would want to put in or talk about would be the public comment part of it that got brought up a few times, and maybe including the MNAC gets notice. That way all the neighborhoods would always get notice, and so it wouldn't become an issue of the public getting notice, since all the representatives of the neighborhood will be at MNAC. So it was something that, I don't know how that, if that's something we could add or how that process works.
It's already existing in code.
Okay, so it's already there.
Already there.
Okay,
Yep,
perfect.
They already get all
Okay,
notifications. of it.
thank you.
Do we have a motion?
I move to approve the amendments to the municipal code to include the low-income incentives into the single-family, multifamily residential districts. So include that into the zoning.
Second?
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Discussion? Tom?
And now, is it a friendly amendment?
We haven't voted on the,
We don't have to vote, we just have to
Don't
make the
Haven't
motion.
voted yet.
okay.
So you can propose a friendly amendment to
Yeah,
that
I'm
motion.
going to propose an amendment as follows. Prior to affordable low housing closing, a mandatory educational process take place with the potential homeowners to take place not limited to household budgeting, house maintenance, normal household expenditures needed for ownership.
Second?
I'd be curious to see how that plays out. I mean, how are you going to,
It already exists with Colshan Community Land Trust. I mean, they have a model that you have to take that class before you can become.
and
a
there's somebody
homeowner.
providing the class, I guess
Yeah.
is what I was looking at. Okay.
Could you require the reporting agency to show, or require the buyer to show proof of participation? Is that the idea, Steve? Is that a buyer comes along and they go to the seller and they say, well, I've completed my training, so to speak?
Yes.
If I could I ask Heather we have a standard that we have in our housing funding stuff that may read to address some things there, so Heather with her cold, she'll be glad to read out loud.
Home buyers which receive financial assistance from the city must receive housing counseling. Counseling must be through a program that is reviewed and approved by the city, HUD, Washington State Housing Trust Fund, or the Washington State Housing Finance Commission.
Okay, where does that exist? Is that, what, a city ordinance attached to
That's our
what?
funding requirements that we have, and so we identify the types of programs that actually have sanctioned counseling programs. And so we let them set the standards of what's required.
Well, then I'll withdraw mine.
Well, Steve, that wouldn't apply to this though, right?
Yeah, no, what I'm
doesn't
saying
apply
is
to
maybe
this.
that language and.
That's what
and-
I'm
and
going to say. I'm going to
substitution for yours.
withdraw the wordage that I just said and apply the verbiage that was just read to this ordinance.
Yeah, except that we wouldn't have city financing, so we would take the thing out about city financing, but we
Yeah.
would say any home buyers would have to go through those programs that she read.
For affordable low housing prior to closing.
And can I ask a question? Just in the discussion of that, the idea, Steve, is just that because the housing is below market rate, that they have people have an idea of the maintenance that's going to be required and what home ownership entails, 5-10 years down the line.
Basically, yes, that they, a lot of times we assume everybody can budget and have them go through the very basics. And these will not, more likely than not, have been previous homeowners. So I think it's important, if we're going to go through these incentives to get low-income families into it, I want to make sure that they're prepared for all the duties of home ownership.
Is that something that could be required as a part of the reporting? So that each time the reporting agency or the developer comes to the city every odd-numbered year, they have to provide evidence that their current or the sales that occurred in that, between that last reporting period had complied with that? Is that where that would fit in? I'm trying to figure out where that would fit into the code, into the ordinance. Or would it be a hearing examiner condition? What might be the best way to incorporate that? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think under the reporting things, that would be exactly where it would fit, yeah. So the hearing examiner would have that, they would have a proposal in their application to meet this requirement, that they have a program set up to do that, and they would have to report out how they accomplish that.
And how much do those trainings cost, do you know?
They usually offer them for free.
They're free, so it's not putting a real financial burden on a low-income applicant.
Yeah, not at all.
But
Yeah,
wouldn't that be a condition of closing then, though, that they check off that they've accomplished that, as opposed to the you know?
Well, I don't think we can put a condition on a private closing in an ordinance, can we? Where we could say, how would that be enforceable? I was just thinking about the way to enforce it would
We're
only
enforcing all sorts of other things here.
be through the reporting, but we're enforcing them through the report. Like, no one goes to the escrow company when the house is sold and makes sure that the applicant is actually low income, right? That actually occurs after the house has been purchased during the reporting.
Yeah, so, I mean, those are the things, if we don't have, the city doesn't have funding in it, first off, if we have funding in it, because that's the easier answer, is that we do check the income and we check that they have home buyer counseling ahead of time. So any project that we have funding, we do check that before we close. In the off chance we are successful in attracting private developers to do this, we would ask them to have, what mechanisms are we going to assure this? And we would want to see somehow they report that before closing, because you really want to have the counseling before you close. And so at least they need to send a report somehow how that's going to happen.
Okay.
And I don't know how that's going to work until we get our first private developer that wants to do this. We'll have to negotiate that.
Phyllis?
Well, another question I had, though, was like the low income to qualify, that could be such a temporary circumstance. Do we care? I mean, they could be unemployed or underemployed at the moment, but even in their own knowledge would know that that's only a temporary situation. Do we care that all of a sudden, 6 months after closing, they would no longer have qualified? Is that an issue that we even bother with?
It is, and I think that would be part of our process that we would set up for any project. There are specific requirements for qualification for income. We look at their tax statements. We look at records from their employer. We get statements from their employer as to what their future income is going to be to assure that they're in that. And we go back to the last 6 months, and so it has to be current. And so we don't allow any certification from more than 6 months old. If they happen to have had changed conditions and that they earn more income, good for them. They end up still qualifying, and no one gets thrown out of their house because they're no longer low income. They're now the homeowner. And
Got it.
So we have a motion and a second. If there's no more discussion, we can have a vote on Steve's friendly amendment to add similar language to what is in the existing code. Is that the housing levy?
It's our housing handbook that we
Housing
have for
handbook.
housing levy, yeah.
And I think Heather can get the details of that. So all those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? So it passes unanimously. Is there any other discussion on the main motion before us? Garrett's motion.
I'd just like to comment that I like taking out those pages and just referring back to BMC 21.10. I think there are a lot of places in the codes where we are redundant, and we can simplify it a lot by referencing rather than repeating here and here and here. So kudos on that.
Well, Garrett, go ahead. No, Garrett, go ahead.
I just, my thoughts on affordable housing in general is, it's a really important topic, for our community, and I think a lot of us have seen that housing has become less affordable, and these programs are complicated, and it would take a lot to navigate this, even as we're trying to simplify it and trying to induce people to use it. Just as we move forward through the comprehensive plan update and through some of our subdivision ordinances, I think we really need to look at market rate affordable housing and what we can do to make market homes more affordable to people. And that's going to be in our land supply, and that's going to be in, what we recommend the UGA to be, and the flexibility we allow on our designs and our subdivision ordinance. So it's an important topic. It's just one way to go about it here, but we got a lot in front of us that we can do that I think could be a lot more impactful.
Well, I would just say two things. One, I just want to also give kudos to David, because I think that this, for a fairly complex topic, I felt like this ordinance was very well written. And I want you to know that. And I feel like the way that, for example, just the design standards were drafted, they're very clear, and most of them are quantifiable. They're not like subject to the interpretation of the planner. It's, you're 30%, you're 4 feet, you're very clear, and I appreciate that. And I just think in general, I mean, there are some complex elements, but, thinning it up, like Tom said, removing redundancy, it's relatively short, and I think it's really, really nice, so I appreciate that. And then in general, there are no rezone, or there's no text amendment criteria. I think the staff report notes that. So we're not evaluating this against any specific criteria. We're really just evaluating it against the comp plan. And I think that it would be very difficult to argue that this ordinance is not consistent with the comp plan. And we have goals regarding housing, affordability, infill, social justice in general in our comp plan. And so I will support it because I believe that absent any specific criteria to evaluate, it's very clearly consistent with the comprehensive plan. And if there's no other comments, we could take a vote.
I do want to clarify that Mr. Cook wrote the whole design review section, so I had nothing to do with it.
Well,
so
then, if he's
kudos
watching
to
right
Mr.
now,
Cook.
kudos to
Yes.
Mr. Cook for writing that.
Yes.
He listened to us when we had our design review hearing several months ago. Any other discussion? Well, we've got a motion and a second. We should have a vote. The motion is to recommend that the council adopt the ordinance as drafted with a friendly amendment to incorporate the educational requirements that Steve identified, and with alternative B for process. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes unanimously. And that is the end of that. So next on our agenda is new and old business, I believe. And my mind is lapsing already. We had something that we were going to talk about during this.
Critical area.
Thank you. That Ms. Harris brought up. Extending the public, postponing our hearing was the suggestion. Continuing the public hearing on the critical areas ordinance. Does the commission have any thoughts on that topic? Right now, we're scheduled to have a public hearing in 2 weeks.
No, next week.
Next week, pardon me, next week. And we're not obligated to make a decision at that time. We can leave it open, have work sessions, or we could postpone or continue, leave the record open for people to make written comment, right? And then have a hearing at a later date.
I would agree with that.
So the meeting after that would be the 5th of February.
The next meeting is the 5th of February.
So the
and then we have
15th
a
of
meeting on the
January,
19th.
so then it would be 3 weeks later. So that'd be lots of time.
About 30 days, yeah.
It
And
would
what's
not
on
be
the
coming
agenda?
before you in February at all. Your dates are full in February.
Yeah, we do have a lot of things going on. February 5th and the 9th. What do we have on the 5th?
So would that mean that we would not have a meeting next week?
No, I got the impression we're going to listen to everything next week. We're just not making a decision next week. Is
Right.
that- am I-
We can do
Okay.
that anyway.
Right.
Yeah, I know,
We
but
don't
I
need-
think
yeah.
somebody wants assurances that we're not going to do that, that we make a decision now, that we wouldn't make a decision next time.
Right.
Is that what I'm getting? No?
Kurt?
If I could, I think one of the things that I would maybe suggest is definitely keeping the public hearing next week so that we can at least begin the process. Ms. Harris has made some comments to me that about how we can make our process a little bit better overall, and I think that she raises some good points there. So my suggestion would be to have the public hearing, continue to have it. Whether or not you want to leave it open or not, that's solely up to your discretion. I think what we can do as staff is we can provide a good overview at that first public hearing to let everyone understand exactly what's being proposed. Because as we've tried to note in the staff report is that a lot of the stuff is very procedural, but it is very complex. I understand that. There's a lot of technical stuff there. So letting us give our presentation, and I think that's a good start. So I would suggest keeping that date and letting us move forward at that time.
Well, I agree. Go ahead.
So we can make a decision to keep it open at that date too?
Correct.
Right, okay.
I didn't anticipate us getting through that in one meeting and making a decision. So I agree with you, Kurt. My personal preference is to defer to staff, to the planning department a little bit on the schedule, because they have the obligation to prepare things and move things forward and balance the coming meetings that we have coming up on other topics. As a number of people noted, we have like 10 things we're working on this spring. So if we start bumping stuff, we start squeezing ourselves later and could be looking at more meetings. So
Let's keep it.
yeah, I think we should keep it. And please be assured that can't make any commitments for the rest of my fellow commissioners, but it's unlikely we'll be making a decision after the presentation from staff. So there should be ample opportunity for public input. I don't think there's any other business on our agenda. There's no director. We're getting Mr. Navifeld's report.
I have nothing to add at this point, besides the fact that we will be holding the public hearing next week on the critical area ordinance. So,
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Anything? All right. Thank you, everybody.
Great job. Great job.